Our story begins in a beautiful and charming countryside town. There, a certain person was finishing hammering the last nail. A large building is revealed, which apparently is a restaurant. He started crying because he finally managed to have his own restaurant after 15 years. That's our protagonist, the level 9 Archmage, Ellison. With this, we dive straight into a classic flashback, and our protagonist, as always, was on his way to school. His dream had always been to become a cook, and because of that, he enrolled in culinary college to become a famous chef. But as expected, a truck appears, and so, it shattered all his dreams. However, instead of dying and reincarnating in another world, the protagonist was kind of teleported, and he didn't even know where he was. And, as in other stories, the protagonist was transported to a fantasy world that, of course, wasn't peaceful at all. Suddenly, a guy approached him, tapped his shoulder, and told him he needed to get up and evacuate. Not understanding anything, the protagonist started following them and asked where they were. The mustachioed guy seemed a bit puzzled, asking if he was an outsider. However, setting that aside, he explained they were in the city of Drake, on the outskirts of the Livern Empire, and all that destruction was caused by red dragons. But the protagonist barely heard anything after the mention of dragons. He was utterly confused. But as they say, humans are adaptable creatures. Thus, he had to find a way to accept the situation. Looking on the bright side, at least he didn't die and got a second chance. The good thing was he wouldn't have to take college entrance exams or join the army after graduation. A person on horseback caught everyone's attention, announcing that the emperor had issued a decree. He explained that the fate of the nation was at stake, with mercenaries fleeing and knights falling. The emperor then delivered a motivational speech, saying everyone present should rise to rebuild the country, fighting for the knights and the emperor. But to the protagonist's bad luck, he had been brought into a war involving dragons, and on top of that, they didn't have enough military forces. Thus, the recruitment system began, and a bald person asked if he was a relative of a knight, a high-ranking officer, or a member of the Templar Knights. But at that point, the protagonist had already lost all sense of reality, didn't believe anything anymore, and yet he was accepted. From that moment on, his life became a living hell. They would wake up before dawn and perform absurd exercises. But at least the protagonist had an advantage. He had great magical potential and, because of that, would be assigned to the magic corps. Even so, magic or not, he still needed to eat, and the food there wasn't exactly great. In fact, it was downright terrible. The potatoes there tasted like cardboard and didn't even have salt. Yet, unlike the protagonist, the people around were praising the food, which, of course, for a culinary student, was very strange, making him question if the people there didn't have taste buds. But looking at it from another perspective, he realized his restaurant would be a huge success if he opened one. That's when the protagonist set his goal, as the only thing left from his previous world was his dream, and for that, he trained. Besides, the dragon was just another monster. If the protagonist worked hard, he would be discharged quickly. But poor guy, if he had known back then that the service time wouldn't be 2 or 3 years, his past self wouldn't have been shocked to know it was a grueling 15 years. Yet, even in the face of this, he somehow managed to endure. And so, we return to the present time, in the city of Drake. Looking at the protagonist's restaurant, a woman was utterly surprised, as she didn't remember there being a restaurant there. But more surprised than her was our protagonist, who couldn't stop crying. The woman managed to understand a bit of the protagonist's pain, so much so that she approached him and asked if he was okay. The protagonist replied that he was just happy because he had finally opened his restaurant. This surprised the woman. She then introduced herself as Rain, and instead of calling the protagonist Ellison, he introduced himself as Elle. Rain continued, saying it had been a long time since the protagonist arrived there, as it was the first time she'd seen him. And the protagonist confirmed that yes, and also that he was not alone. He was with a friend he had made in the army, and he couldn't introduce her because she slept a lot, so she would probably only wake up at night. But going back to the restaurant talk, Rain asked if the protagonist needed a place to buy meat. He confirmed that he did, saying that, in fact, he was heading to the village right now to check out a butcher shop. And luckily for the protagonist, Rain's husband was a butcher. But before they went, Rain explained that her husband had a bit of a hot temper. So, if the protagonist thought he was being too rude, he should just tell her husband that she had sent him there. The protagonist was happy to meet someone as kind as Rain and even asked what kind of grumpy husband she had, given how amazing she was. Also, the protagonist had spent 15 years in the army. He had dealt with all kinds of people, but not with that kind. Poor guy, he was left completely awkward in his corner. So, the protagonist tried to talk to him, but his voice was very shaky. He couldn't even mention the meat business, but the old man quickly banged on the table, saying he didn't sell meat. The old man began to rant that he had seen many people like the protagonist, claiming they just wanted to buy cheap meat and sell it off just before it spoiled. He went on about how people had scammed him like that for 3 years, and though he didn't know the protagonist, his face looked exactly like theirs, so he wouldn't sell his meat. Suddenly, he got a huge pan hit to the head, and it was none other than Rain, declaring he shouldn't act that way. Otherwise, they would keep losing customers, and she apologized to the protagonist for her husband's behavior. She then asked if the protagonist was looking for Bellerin meat, which he confirmed, but the old man wasn't very keen on selling it. However, a couple's argument broke out, and meanwhile, the protagonist was caught in the crossfire, thinking he just wanted to go home. In the end, as we already know, the old man lost the argument and went to work, while Rain once again apologized to the protagonist. She commented that he acted that way because he also used to run a restaurant but turned grumpy after being betrayed by his friend. Rain noticed he had also been recruited before, but just hearing the words recruitment and mercenary in the same sentence made him start crying. At that moment, the old man returned, asking the protagonist to show his skills. But the meat in the bag wasn't the one he had asked for, yet the old man teased him, saying he should make something good with it, because he couldn't just give away the precious Bellerin meat. But with that, his wife was dying to hit him again. What the old man was proposing, in short, was for the protagonist to impress him with a dish using that meat. But before the old man could say another word, the pan was already waiting for him. The protagonist then asked Rain if she hadn't been a bit too harsh, but she replied that he was quite resilient, so it didn't matter. Besides, he was acting like a child, so he deserved to be treated as one. The protagonist then said it was okay, and he would cook that meat for them. This surprised Rain, and the protagonist declared that they should come to his restaurant at night because he would make a great dish with that meat. She was a bit confused because the protagonist had asked for Bellerin meat but was taking something else. However, he replied that it didn't matter. Rain was a bit worried because it was Wooba belly fat. In that world, animals were called different names. For example, cows were called Wooka, chickens were called Palenque, wolves were Bellerin, and pigs were known as Wooba. So, in the end, the meat the protagonist received from the butcher was none other than pork belly. In the world where the protagonist was, Palenque, also known as chicken, was a very expensive ingredient, making Wooba, or pork, the more economical meat option. And the cheapest cut was pork belly, but the people of that world didn't like pork belly much. That said, the recipe the protagonist was going to make was simple: grilled pork. Now, returning to Rain's perspective and her grumpy husband. The old man was asking what he had done wrong, and Rain questioned since when he came up with the principle of only supplying meat to approved restaurants. Moreover, in her eyes, the protagonist seemed like an honest and kind person, and they were simply helping out a new neighbor. However, the old man still didn't believe it. After all, they had only known him for a day, but Rain pointed out that if anyone had a terrible eye for judging character, it was him, as he was always falling for scams. The whole idea of testing his culinary skills was just an excuse. What the old man really wanted to assess was the protagonist's sense of responsibility. But the old man didn't want to admit that, and remarked that he had a very refined palate. If the protagonist's culinary skills weren't up to the standard of his meat, he wouldn't sell to him. After this, we are taken to another time, more specifically during the war. As it was a war, unforeseen events were common, and in this case, a soldier got his leg trapped under a rock and called for help. At that very moment, a large goblin appeared, intending to kill him. However, right then, someone activated their magic called thermal blade. This caused a massive flash of light, terrifying all the monsters in the vicinity. Now, it was the monsters who would be buried under the rocks. Witnessing this, the soldiers were utterly amazed. They shouted that the 9th class Archmage Ellison was there. However, the same Archmage was now busy cooking food. The protagonist explained that every magic had its own unique applications. For instance, thermal blade could be used to cut meat and enhance marinade absorption. Additionally, he shared some important tips on how to make the meat's texture even crispier. Anyway, he finished preparing the meat. Just then, Rain arrived, and the protagonist told them they could sit down as the food was almost ready. Rain started complimenting how neat and organized he was, but the old man remarked that he probably only cleaned the place up because they were coming. Rain told him to hush and wait for the food. She then picked up the pan and carried it with her. Back to the protagonist's side, he began a tutorial. Once the griddle was slightly heated, a bit of oil needed to be added. Since pork belly is fatty, you only need enough oil to prevent it from sticking to the pan. When placing the meat, start with the skin side down. Otherwise, as the inside cooks, the skin might dry out, making it hard to achieve an even sear. The protagonist flipped the meat to ensure heat reached both sides. He sprinkled a bit of salt to avoid blandness, cut the pieces into neat portions, and to finish, since it was grilled, he added onions. To balance the meal and make it lighter, he prepared a salad, and in the end, he plated everything separately for a clean presentation. Once again, while Rain was praising him, the old man was complaining. As soon as Rain took her first bite, she was utterly amazed, even imagining happy little pigs running across the field. She asked the protagonist if this was really Wooba Belly, which was obvious since it was the only meat he had. Once more, he began explaining every detail of the dish. In any case, he was happy that she enjoyed it, and Rain declared that supplying him with meat would ensure she got to taste his cooking again. However, on the old man's side, the plate was completely empty, and he was furious, practically drooling, saying the meat was all gone. Trembling, the protagonist nervously asked if he at least enjoyed it. The old man said he needed much more meat, but once again, he was smacked with a pan. Rain declared that if he wanted more, he should ask politely, not like a starving ogre. After clearing his throat, the old man admitted that the protagonist had passed his test. To be honest, among all the Wooba dishes he had eaten so far, this was the best. He then assured him that he only needed to specify the type of meat he wanted, and the old man himself would supply the best meat in the Laverne Empire. At last, the protagonist secured his meat supplier. He could consider his first day in business a success. But unlike the protagonist, who was doing everything to chase success, his friend was just waking up in the late afternoon, and she only woke up because of the smell. And so, we have a 1-week time skip. Since the protagonist announced his restaurant, people have been captivated by his Wooba Belly dish, and he was happy that the business was doing well. Customers leaving the restaurant always praised the dishes. As he was cooking a lot, the condiments and spices eventually ran out. In the world where the protagonist was, these were extremely expensive and rare, and as such, not everyone could use them freely. Moreover, the quality and variety of the products there didn't even come close to the products from the modern world. But he had a special way to get spices. For that, he placed a gold coin in the middle of a circle with various engravings. Then he began to cast a spell. That was the way the protagonist solved his problem. Using a type of summoning magic from that world, he managed to bring objects from the modern world. But in reality, he had coincidentally created this magic while looking for a way to return to his original world. And as it was said in that world, magic depends on how someone uses it, and there's also a limit to the size and weight of the objects. But that magic was still a great help, even though it wasn't perfect magic. However, he felt bad about simply taking other people's products. He always sends a gold coin in exchange, along with other supplies. Unless they are perishable products like fresh meat, eggs, or vegetables. All of those arrive spoiled, and even processed products have an expiration date, but that didn't seem to be a problem. In reality, the protagonist didn't know the exact reason for this. Moreover, there was another feature that made him incredibly exhausted. Even he, who carried the title of Archmage, could only use this summoning once a day, and combining hunger with a craving for food, it was the perfect time to rest while having a beer, but there wasn't any. Well, there was, but Rurin drank it all. However, irritated, the protagonist gave her a good punch on the head, and with that, she woke up, though she didn't understand anything, and the protagonist scolded her, saying she drank all the beer without telling him and left everything messy. In her defense, Rurin claimed it happened because the protagonist hadn't left her any of the delicious food he made that day, and she said she was a dragon, and cleaning up messes was something inferior beings did, not a superior being like her. But the protagonist didn't care, and since she was standing idle, he told her to peel some onions. She was quite upset because a proud dragon was doing the work of an inferior being like that. As he said, she really was a dragon, although it didn't seem like it since she was in human form now. In reality, the protagonist found her after she became an orphan. She had lost her mother and home during the war against the Red Dragons. Since he couldn't leave her in that place, he decided to help her. And so, they had been together ever since. However, even though she had lived for hundreds of years, she was still very young for a dragon, which made her immature. Trying to motivate her, the protagonist declared that if she finished chopping all those onions, he would reward her with a nice hamburger. But at that moment, someone arrived at the restaurant, and it was none other than the butcher, whose name we now learn is Noel. I'll keep calling him the butcher for simplicity. He asked the protagonist to bring beer and some snacks. That was a bit of a problem since all the beer was gone, so he found another solution. It was sake, and of course, he changed the bottle to avoid suspicion. Then he served the butcher. At first glance, the butcher thought the drink the protagonist brought was strange because it looked like water. The protagonist just told him to taste it before complaining about anything. In reality, that wasn't sake, it was soju. The butcher was a bit worried because the smell was quite unusual. But even so, he didn't refuse. He took the first sip and ate the food. He replied that it wasn't as bad as he thought. It was bitter at first, but the sweet aftertaste harmonized well with the meat. The two together had a unique charm compared to the salad. And he even admitted that the protagonist's cuisine was truly extraordinary, which surprised the protagonist since he was being unusually honest. But the old man ordered another bottle. Then he drank one more, then two, and asked for a third bottle. The protagonist told him to calm down since he was already very drunk. However, the old man declared that he had to drink until he passed out today. The protagonist asked if something had happened, and with a very sad face, the old man declared that he thought Rain was cheating on him. Hearing this, the protagonist was very surprised, and the old man began to explain that, at first, she would say she was going somewhere. But lately, this had been happening more often. Every month, on a certain day, she would dress nicely and go to visit someone. And since she had been doing this for several months, he decided to follow her, only to find out, in the end, that she was meeting one of his old comrades from his mercenary days, a very close friend of his. Moreover, this friend had disappeared after opening his butcher shop, or so the story went, which made the old man believe he must be too ashamed to look him in the eye because he was with Rain. She had gone out today, but it wasn't her usual day to leave. It even seemed like she didn't care about him. But after hearing all this, the protagonist told him to calm down, because getting completely drunk wasn't going to solve his problems. However, the old man replied no, he had to drink until he collapsed. The worst part of it all was that he still loved Rain. Even with the situation as it was, he couldn't live without her, so he didn't know what to do. At that, the protagonist simply told him to leave everything to him. Even though he hadn't known Rain for long, he believed she wasn't that kind of person. Switching to Rurin's perspective, she was still peeling onions. The protagonist appeared and told her to stop complaining and get ready because they had a job to do. Or if she preferred, she could keep peeling onions, right? Which, of course, she rejected, saying she would go with him. And so they went to the city, where some kind of festival was taking place. On the rooftops, looking like bandits, there were our protagonist and Rurin. They were scanning the area because, according to the old butcher, Rain was in one of those fancy restaurants. And indeed she was, sitting with a man next to her, likely the friend the old man had mentioned. Well, now it was Rurin's turn to act, right? The protagonist asked her to eavesdrop on their conversation. But since she was a bit annoyed, she wasn't going to do it for free, was she? The protagonist, knowing this, said he would make her 2 hamburgers. With that, she agreed and began relaying their conversation. Rain asked if it wasn't time to tell her husband. The man in front of her was Mr. Mint. She mentioned that her husband was becoming increasingly suspicious of their relationship. She also expressed sadness that Mint no longer visited his butcher shop. Mint explained that if her husband found out he had helped with the butcher shop, he'd want to avoid him. Hearing this, the protagonist was a bit surprised and confirmed with Rurin that this was exactly what Mint had said, which confirmed that their meeting wasn't some secret affair. With that, the protagonist simply leapt off the roof, telling Rurin to head home and wait. He entered the restaurant and interrupted their conversation. Right away, he said that, as Rain had mentioned earlier, the old man was misinterpreting the situation. Speaking of the old man, we returned to him, and he was completely drunk. But just at that moment, who arrives at the restaurant? None other than Rain and Mr. Mint. Mint looked a bit embarrassed since it had been a while since they last saw each other. The old man began to get nervous because the two were together. Rain was trying to explain the situation, but the old man wouldn't listen. Since she was with his best friend, the person he trusted the most, he said he wouldn't forgive him. So he went to punch him, and Mint was already bracing for it. But just then, a magical barrier appeared, surprising everyone. Unsurprisingly, it was the protagonist who cast the barrier. He declared that, instead of resorting to violence, they should clarify the misunderstanding since violence wouldn't solve anything. The protagonist explained that the person who had loaned the money to open the butcher shop was none other than Mr. Mint, shocking the old man. But the protagonist simply walked past him, saying he should sit at the table. He said he would prepare the food, and since the old man was very drunk, he would make a soup-like dish to calm his stomach. And since Rain had given him Bellerin meat, he decided to make a shabu-shabu. It's a very interesting dish, a hot pot with meat, vegetables, mushrooms, and other ingredients. And once again, the protagonist started explaining the tutorial for making this dish. But skipping all his explanation, the dish was ready and looked beautiful. He hoped the argument had also come to an end. Meanwhile, on the argument's side, the old man was asking if what the protagonist had said was true. Rain confirmed that it was and mentioned that after they lost everything because they were deceived. It was Mint who lent almost his entire life savings to fund their butcher shop. Now that the shop could at least sustain itself, she met with him every month to repay the debt. However, the old man wasn't buying the story. According to what he had been told, the money came from a lord's castle, returned after they caught the scammer. But Mint explained that the old man probably wouldn't have accepted the money if he had known the truth. With that, Mint also apologized for not congratulating them when they opened the butcher shop. In reality, he didn't have much of a choice, because if the truth ever came out, it would look like he had deceived them. However, he didn't know the situation would worsen so much. Just as the old man was about to start ranting, the protagonist interrupted their conversation. He said that dinner was ready. A bit embarrassed, he apologized and explained that the vegetables couldn't cook for too long, and that's why he interrupted the conversation. Besides, wouldn't it be better to talk while eating? Ment asked why the meat was so thin, and the protagonist explained that he had sliced it that way, since it's a dish where the meat is cooked in the soup and eaten directly. So Ment followed the protagonist's example. He dipped the meat into the broth, put everything on a fork, and took a bite. Apparently, he really enjoyed the dish and told the old man to try it too. The moment the old man tasted the broth, he was completely surprised. Then Ment asked if he remembered the Battle of Purin. On that day, the old man had taken a stab wound to protect him, and because of that, Ment remembered it very well. And another thing, they ran out of food supplies because the battle lasted longer than expected, and the only things to eat were potatoes and water. That's when Ment caught a wild Bellerin. But he ended up fainting beside the old man because he had only managed to catch one and lost a lot of blood. The soup they made with the Bellerin meat was weak, and the smell was terrible. However, somehow, that meal was better than anything else they'd had, and the old man agreed with Ment. Ment continued, saying that as the old man had asked earlier why he had helped them, it was simple. He didn't need to retire, and he didn't have other plans, because nothing was more important than helping them. That's when the old man started crying while apologizing. Seeing this, the protagonist and Ment were very happy. Thus, the argument and misunderstanding were resolved. Of course, only for them, because the protagonist was in big trouble. Rurin was declaring that the protagonist had broken his promise to the dragon, as she was absolute. The protagonist replied that it wasn't such a big deal. It was still early, so he could still make the hamburgers, but Rurin didn't accept that as an answer and started ranting. At that moment, Ment stepped in and covered Rurin's mouth to make her stop talking. The protagonist commented that he hoped Ment had enjoyed the meal, and Ment replied that it was really good, but he had come there for another reason. He revealed that a group of mercenaries had recently been assigned a mission to escort a very important person, and they wanted to have a kind of farewell dinner before their departure. So, if it wasn't too much trouble, he would like that dinner to be held at the protagonist's restaurant, which, of course, was quite surprising. But since an important group would be coming to the restaurant, the protagonist thought he'd get the best meat and went looking for palenque. For those who don't know, that's chicken. However, the butcher didn't have that meat. As the protagonist himself had said, it was very rare. However, the protagonist felt a bit disappointed, as the old man had promised to provide him with any meat he wanted. But according to the old man, palenque was a different case altogether. Speaking of which, he had heard rumors that some had recently appeared in the Limon forest. So the protagonist headed there, but the palenque was a monster resembling a chicken. And since the protagonist was in another world, they were completely different, constantly changing their habitat, making them hard to find. To make things worse, they ran extremely fast when chased, which made catching them incredibly difficult and increasingly infuriated the protagonist. At one point, the thought of burning down the entire forest even crossed his mind. Seeing how much trouble it was, he regretted adding that meat to his menu. So, the protagonist gave up and said it was Rurin's turn. But, as we already know, she wouldn't do it for free and demanded not to wash dishes for a week. Then, she started emanating a powerful aura. It was, in fact, a skill called Dragon's Fear, which, of course, easily caught the palenque. Rurin was completely thrilled, telling the protagonist he should rely on her more often. The protagonist replied that if she enjoyed it so much, she should do the same with 15 more palenques. Sometime after completing the task, there was Rurin again, drinking a beer after the job. However, the protagonist commented that it didn't really count as work since she just scared the creatures. Rurin began explaining her side, saying it was her job, but the protagonist simply told her not to drink too much since they would have customers that evening. Besides, the dish he was preparing today went well with beer, so it wouldn't be good if she drank it all. Speaking of the customers, they had already arrived, asking Ment if he had really picked a good place to eat. Ment even questioned whether they didn't trust him, but the junior mercenary, Miltine, said he trusted him and was sure the dish would be delicious. Just then, the protagonist arrived, interrupting their conversation. Ment apologized, saying they were laughing and making too much noise, but as the protagonist replied, since it was a celebration, it couldn't be quiet. At that, Ment introduced Miltine to the protagonist. Miltine started praising him, saying Ment had spoken highly of the restaurant. The protagonist commented that he hoped to meet their expectations. Then, the protagonist placed the dish on the table, surprising everyone. Before they could say anything, he explained that the meat was palenque, which, of course, shocked Miltine because, as mentioned several times before, it was very rare. Although, it seemed the protagonist didn't quite realize that. As soon as the three of them took their first bites, they were astonished. One was praising the dish, another was speechless, and the third couldn't comment because his mouth was full. This sparked an argument about not eating it all and saving some for others. Since there were many customers, the protagonist asked Rurin for help. However, she started boasting again, saying she was a dragon and shouldn't be serving humans. Moreover, she had caught a rare creature like the palenque, so she deserved a bit of rest, right? Facing this, the protagonist had to get a little creative. He asked if she remembered their promise to open a restaurant once the war was over, that they would go through everything together. He thought that promise was unbreakable, but who would have guessed? A dragon's heart could change so easily. It was almost heartbreaking to think he couldn't trust the dragon anymore, and since she didn't want to help, she might as well go sleep somewhere else. Instantly, she agreed, making the protagonist's plan successful, and the night turned into a feast of fried chicken and drinks. In the midst of it all, Rurin was utterly lost. By the time the party was over, she was completely exhausted. Since the protagonist wasn't a demon king or anything evil, they offered her a reward for her hard work. At the end of the shift, they enjoyed some fried chicken and beer in peace. The protagonist noticed that Rurin had even cleaned the tables, something he hadn't asked her to do. Looking at her, it seemed like she was finally maturing. She responded simply, saying it was because this was a restaurant, their restaurant. Deep down, the protagonist felt quite emotional about it, but he took the opportunity to appreciate the moment, asking if he could cancel the bet about hunting palenque in exchange for washing dishes for a week. But setting that aside, another customer was arriving, and Rurin apparently noticed them but hid behind the protagonist. When the protagonist asked what was going on, a voice declared that it was unpleasant, that human cities were always so unpleasant to visit, and seeing him, the protagonist commented that it had been a long time. That person was, in fact, the ancient black dragon, Metadana. The protagonist immediately stood up and asked why he had come there, but the old man wasn't interested in talking to the protagonist. He declared to Rurin that she was living in a very small place for a dragon, asking why she was hiding behind the protagonist, to which she responded that it was nothing. But seeing that the old man was talking to Rurin, the protagonist asked if he had come to take her back. Because, as far as he remembered, no one could go against his care for Rurin, or had he forgotten how badly he got burned the last time he tried? The old man said the protagonist was full of himself, but yes, he had come there because of Rurin. However, Rurin didn't want to go with them, as they had abandoned her once. The old man responded that it wasn't exactly like that, he had just been delayed a little. But before the old man could keep talking nonsense, the protagonist told him to shut up. After all, they had a promise between them, and promises were sacred to dragons. The old man agreed that they indeed had a promise to leave Rurin in the protagonist's care. However, there was an older promise. The promise was that the age when a black dragon is accepted as an adult in the family is 800 years. Until then, a dragon without its own lair is protected and sent to the family's sacred land. But since Rurin was using her mother's lair, which was destroyed in the last war, and as she would turn 800 next year, she would have to go to the sacred place. Those were the family's rules, and no one could defy them. If this wasn't fulfilled, it would mean war, but the protagonist didn't back down, saying if they wanted war, he would go to war. Hearing this enraged the old man, and the protagonist simply declared that if he wanted war so badly, he could come at him. However, hearing this didn't sit well with the old man. He started saying that the protagonist might have eaten a dragon's heart, but that didn't guarantee he could win a war against their race. Seeing this, Rurin declared it was fine, she would go with them, because they shouldn't start a war. But the protagonist wasn't talking about that, he was talking about the dragon's lair. This caught both the old man and Rurin off guard, and the protagonist continued, saying they still had an entire year, so they just needed to finish building the lair within that time, and by then, they should have gathered enough treasures, so they could start now. Seeing this, even the old man turned pale and practically lost his composure. He commented that if the protagonist did that, it was possible, but since it was settled, he would return in a year. And so, the protagonist began building a dragon's lair, which, as the name suggests, is literally a cave where a dragon lives. Of course, it must have a magnificent interior and dazzling treasures, symbols of a dragon's lair. Because of this, building one obviously consumes a lot of time and resources. However, since the protagonist's restaurant was very successful, they didn't have much time. Moreover, the vast majority of those customers were there because of the rumor that they were selling palenques. He even tried to tell them it was a limited menu and not a big deal, but it didn't help. If things continued like this, the protagonist wouldn't die from war but from overwork, so he needed to find a way to reduce the number of customers. Sometime later, in another location, the butcher was utterly shocked, and the reason was that there were several palenques perched in the trees. He asked the protagonist what the hell that was. The protagonist declared it was simple, he would supply the butcher with palenques. This way, his shop would be the only one in the empire selling them, and as a result, he would attract many customers. But the butcher wasn't too convinced, saying the difficulty wasn't finding Palanquius but catching them. However, the protagonist told him to relax since Man's group had already caught one. And because the protagonist was offering the Palanque, the profit would be split 50-50, or, for close friends, 50% each. Still, the old man wasn't fully convinced and even asked if the protagonist was trying to trick him. However, the protagonist assured him that half was more than fair. Besides, he wouldn't supply it in large quantities. So either way, it wouldn't generate much profit for them. That's why he suggested using the popularity of the Palanque to promote other meats. After all that talk, the old man finally agreed. However, he added that there was still one problem. Palanquius change habitats periodically. But that wasn't an issue either. Out of nowhere, the protagonist raised a dome or some sort of barrier around the forest. Seeing this, the old man was caught off guard, realizing this wasn't something one could learn in just a few years of magic. The old man asked who on earth he was, to which the protagonist simply replied for him to stay quiet. Because, after all, he was just a retired restaurant owner after the war. In any case, it seemed the protagonist's plan had worked and was quite effective, because the next day there weren't as many customers, or rather, there weren't any customers at all. However, Rurin wondered if it was worth feeling happy about this, while even the protagonist thought they'd at least get a few customers. But looking at it another way, they now had time to build the lair. Rurin, delighted, asked the protagonist if, by any chance, once they finished building the lair, he would live there with her. The protagonist, of course, replied that he wouldn't. Hearing this, Rurin became very upset. She argued that, in that case, building the lair made no sense, so they should just declare war on the Black Dragon family instead. But the protagonist told her to calm down because the lair would be nearby. And it really was, literally on the hill where the restaurant stood. Since the restaurant was on the outskirts of the city, the entire hill was the protagonist's property. However, as they were going to dig into that hill, they needed to stabilize the interior with a barrier while continuing the excavation. Otherwise, the restaurant would obviously collapse, and Rurin, all excited, declared they should start digging immediately. But the protagonist said no. He told her he was returning to the restaurant. After all, the restaurant couldn't be left unattended for long. This completely deflated Rurin. Back at the restaurant, the protagonist was enjoying some peace, as it had been a while since he had some free time. But just then, a customer arrived, and he appeared to be some sort of noble, judging by his fine clothes. The boy asked if that restaurant was the famous one he had heard about. The protagonist replied that it was a restaurant, but whether it was famous or not, he didn't know. When the boy mentioned the Palanque, the protagonist understood which part of the fame he was referring to. However, the protagonist explained that the Palanque was from Mr. Noel's shop, that is, the old butcher's place, for those unfamiliar. The problem was that the boy couldn't go to the old man's butcher shop, so he asked if the protagonist could make him another dish. And since the protagonist was resourceful, of course, he was going to prepare a new dish for him. Even the protagonist had noticed that the boy seemed to be a noble's child with some issues based on his situation. In any case, the first rule of business is never to discriminate against customers. Besides, the only dish the protagonist could think of to please a child's palate was a hamburger. In fact, he sometimes made them because of Rurin, and for this, the protagonist used sirloin. To summarize the process, chop and shape the meat, season with a bit of salt, and fry it alongside butter-toasted bread. Then, place the hamburger on top of some greens, cover it with a demi-glace garlic sauce, and finally add a fried egg on top. It's delicious. And so, the hamburger, loved even by a dragon, was ready. But since the hamburger was something from another place, the boy didn't know what it was and asked if it was some kind of sandwich. The protagonist replied that it was similar. As the boy was about to take his first bite, a butler arrived, calling for the boy and asking what he was doing in a place like that. It seemed the boy was running away from those people since he was utterly shocked. The butler didn't hold back his words, saying that eating food from a place like that would make him sick. Faced with this, the protagonist had no choice but to step in because the butler had crossed the line. The butler continued, saying he didn't know how the protagonist had prepared that meal. However, there was one thing he needed to know. That boy was the son of the Baron of the city of Grake. His name was Diran Grake, but the protagonist didn't care if he was a baron or a count. In the end, he was his customer, so what was the problem with that? This led to an argument between the two, and Diran asked them to stop fighting. Not knowing how much the hamburger had cost, Diran offered a gold coin since he couldn't eat it. And so, Diran simply left, looking quite downcast. The protagonist was a little disappointed since he had made the hamburger, and the boy didn't even get to eat it. Some time later, none other than Rurin arrived, complaining that it was now the protagonist's turn to dig the hole. She had been digging until now, and her hands hurt. The protagonist told her to calm down and that he would do it tomorrow. But the most important thing now was that they had somewhere to go, so the protagonist needed her teleportation. Once again, Rurin said she'd only do it for payment. The protagonist replied that he'd make her something to eat when they got back. In reality, he was doing this because he'd been paid, and the place they needed to go was the Baron's castle. There, Diran was still looking quite downcast. At that moment, someone appeared. The protagonist immediately said that Diran had forgotten his meal earlier, and since he hadn't been able to try it, the protagonist had brought it for him. But before that, the protagonist had reheated the food because no one wants to eat cold food. It seemed Diran was starving, even drooling, but just then, someone called out to him, asking if someone else was there with him. Given the noise, terrified, Diran asked the protagonist what they should do now. The protagonist said it was obvious. He should say it was nothing. He was the heir to the lord and a baron, so they couldn't refuse his order. Therefore, he just needed a bit of confidence. But Diran had never done that before, and every time he tried, they always ignored him. Meanwhile, the person at the door was knocking even louder, and the first to get angry was Rurin. She shouted that it was nothing and that they should leave. This surprised Diran because she was using his voice. But in the end, the person at the door obeyed the order. This left Diran astonished, and the protagonist explained to him that he needed to establish his authority on his own. But suddenly, the protagonist was interrupted as Diran dropped to his knees before him, asking the protagonist to be his teacher. To understand a bit more about Diran, we need to revisit his story. First, his mother passed away giving birth to him, and his father remarried soon after. Because of this, he spent most of his time with his stepmother. But she was quite strict with him, always telling him what he shouldn't do or what would never work. She constantly reminded him to be careful with his actions since he was the Lord's son. Despite all this, he still loved her because they had shared some good moments. However, everything changed when his father became bedridden due to illness. From that point on, she never looked at him or spoke to him directly during dinners or celebrations. Diran only wanted to become a good person, just like his father. However, the servants tried to control him and restrict his movements under his stepmother's orders. As a result, he had no one to talk to, and everyone ignored him. This made him feel that he wouldn't be treated any better, even if he inherited the Lord's title. But his thoughts changed after today's events. That's why he asked the protagonist to teach him the proper manners to become a good lord. Still, I wonder where he got the idea that the protagonist could teach him anything like that. One thing had nothing to do with the other. The protagonist was simply a restaurant owner. But it made some sense because, if it were the protagonist, the servant would have obeyed his command to leave. However, the protagonist knew this was more about a lack of confidence. From the way the boy asked the protagonist to be his teacher, it seemed like he was purposefully suppressing his energetic and lively personality. So, the protagonist gave him a simple piece of advice: look people in the eye when talking to them. Since he said he wanted to become a good lord, that position comes with responsibilities. Therefore, he should be able to take responsibility for every word that comes out of his mouth. The protagonist didn't mean he shouldn't listen to others. Rather, he should make sure to analyze the words before making a decision he believed in. And if the decision favored him, he should accept it. But if it didn't, he needed to take responsibility for it. Perhaps that was the step-by-step guide to becoming a good lord. In any case, the protagonist had to leave because his restaurant was unattended. He even did a little self-promotion to Diran, telling him to return if he liked the hamburger. With the protagonist's words on his mind, Diran ate and realized it really was good. But once again, he somewhat misunderstood the protagonist's words and thought that, to become a good lord, it meant being someone who makes an effort to ensure everyone can enjoy such delicious food. Back at the restaurant, Rurin remarked that the protagonist seemed to care a lot about the boy. But the protagonist replied that he was simply doing what he was paid to do. That was 100,000 runas, while his hamburger only cost 200. That explained why the protagonist gave him that lecture, or coaching session if you will. After all, he didn't want to feel like a thief. Plus, he now understood why he welcomed Diran back to the restaurant. Because imagine having a customer like him, paying with a gold coin every time. The protagonist would get rich quickly. Switching scenes, in a forest near the city of Drake, there was a strangely popular clinic run by a skilled doctor. He had even learned healing magic because, after all, he was a doctor. However, that wasn't the reason for its popularity. The person injured there was none other than Rain. She had burned herself with a dish. But back to the main point, the real reason clients flocked to this remote clinic outside the city center was because it was run by an elf, not a human, and her name was Helena. After healing Rain, Helena seemed unwell, and Rain naturally asked what was wrong. Helena admitted she was thinking of returning to her hometown, explaining that she loved healing and helping people. Despite everyone's opposition, she had left her city. But reality was different from what she imagined. No one was genuinely interested in her treatment. They just wanted to meet her at any cost. Instead of seeing her as a doctor, people viewed her in a different light. For example, some time ago, a woman became extremely angry, accusing her of seducing her husband, and slapped her for no reason. Helena didn't understand why, as all she wanted to do was heal people because she enjoyed it. However, due to this situation, staying there was becoming increasingly difficult. Hearing this, Rain asked if, by any chance, Helena didn't like her. Helena replied, of course not, she had nothing against her. So, Rain asked if having more things she liked would make her stay. Helena hesitated, and Rain continued using her husband as an example. There were many things she didn't like about him, like his snoring and naivety, but there was something she did like about him. The fact that he was reliable, cared only for her, and worked hard at everything he did. And as Helena herself had said, she enjoyed treating people, right? Helena agreed. Rain then suggested she visit a restaurant on the hill that night. Helena quickly understood the restaurant was related to their conversation, but Rain explained that this was the first step to increasing the reasons for her to stay there, one of which would be that restaurant. Back to the protagonist, he was working when the old butcher and another person arrived. The old man asked why the protagonist wasn't at the restaurant. He explained that the construction project had him tied up. The old man then introduced the person next to him as Nellen, his nephew, and they had something to discuss, so to accompany the conversation, they prepared wooba meat. The protagonist mentioned that they could go without worry since Rurin was at the restaurant. But the old man added that there was a clinic run by an elf. Rain had recommended his restaurant to the doctor there, so it was very likely that the doctor was already at the restaurant. If that were the case, the protagonist would have to head there, and as they made their way to the restaurant, he commented that it was quite unusual. Elves normally never leave their native forests, so it was almost certain that the elf was popular, and the old man agreed, saying that all the boys in the neighborhood practically lived at her clinic. Just hearing that already made the protagonist tired, but the moment he entered the restaurant, a very strange scene was unfolding. The elf was kneeling while Rurin looked absolutely furious, and the elf was apologizing profusely to Rurin. However, Rurin declared that she was polite and would forgive her if she spent the rest of her life as her subordinate. Seeing this, the protagonist didn't understand anything, and when the elf noticed him, she returned to being completely normal, saying they had finally gained another subordinate. Of course, the protagonist scolded her because she was arguing with one of his customers. To understand what happened, we need to go back a little. It all started when Rurin was relaxing. Helena arrived, asking if that was Alyssan's restaurant. Rurin replied that it was, but he wasn't there at the moment. Rurin quickly noticed that she was an elf and also noted how beautiful she was. The elf thanked her and said that Rurin was also beautiful, though she seemed much younger. That's when Rurin began to fume, saying, "Younger? Are you saying I'm young? I may be young for my race, but I'm still older than you. How dare you say that to my face?" At that moment, Helena began kneeling and apologizing, and that's precisely when the protagonist arrived, witnessing the whole scene. After giving Rurin a piece of his mind, he invited them both inside. Once inside, Helena was utterly confused, even questioning if she was dreaming because what stood before her was unmistakably a dragon. There was one thing everyone knew, from children to elders: you should never anger a dragon. They are walking natural disasters capable of burning down villages and even entire cities, making them the strongest race. However, setting aside all the mysticism and legends, what she was seeing in front of her was a dragon being treated like a child by none other than a mere human, or whatever the protagonist was now. Speaking of the protagonist, he approached her, apologizing for what had happened earlier. Helena immediately asked if he was human, and at first, the protagonist was confused. But he replied that yes, he was human. The protagonist realized it made sense for her to ask, given that he had just scolded a dragon. He approached her, explaining that it might seem strange since he was living with a dragon, and it was a bit complicated to explain. That's why he only asked her to keep it a secret from others. Helena instantly agreed, as she didn't want to disrupt a dragon's activity. After all, she didn't want to die, though the protagonist knew Rurin wouldn't kill her. To confirm, the protagonist asked if she was the doctor Miss Rain had recommended. She confirmed, and hearing that, the protagonist realized he was in trouble since he had made the worst first impression. Helena continued, saying she had heard that the place served delicious food, even vegetarian dishes. That's why she had come, and the protagonist confirmed that they did. He asked if there was anything she wouldn't eat. Helena replied that it wasn't an ethical issue but that her body simply couldn't digest meat, so anything without meat was fine. The protagonist began thinking about what to make for her, but quickly decided. He said he would prepare the dish right away. There are many meatless dishes, but one of the simplest is tomato sauce pasta. So here's the protagonist tutorial. Add chopped onion, garlic, and mushrooms to a heated pan with olive oil and saute. Thus, the different flavors harmonize to create a delicious aroma. Next, chop the tomatoes and add them to the pan. Season with salt, sugar, and other spices, then lower the heat. Make sure the sauce doesn't burn, and while the sauce loses moisture, boil the pasta for 8 minutes. Reserve some of the cooking water, and finally, mix the pasta with the sauce, adjusting the sauce's viscosity with the reserved water. And voila! It's ready. For anyone who wants to try it, it seems like a fairly simple recipe. The protagonist served Helena and advised her to eat using a fork, assuring her that he hadn't used any meat at all. So, there was no need to worry. The moment she took her first bite, we had a time skip because we didn't get to see her immediate reaction. The protagonist was serving a big cut of meat to the old butcher and his nephew. However, the protagonist noticed that the nephew didn't look very pleased and wondered if the food wasn't to his liking. Speaking of good food, how was Helena? Simple. She was enjoying the pasta, looking nothing like the elf she had been earlier. Just as she was basking in her moment of glory, the protagonist arrived and asked if the pasta suited her palate, to which Helena confirmed it did. Seeing how embarrassed she was, the protagonist asked if she didn't frequent other restaurants often. She replied no, explaining that she attracted too much attention and usually only ate vegetables she bought from smaller markets. It wasn't that she avoided restaurants, rather, most of them didn't have vegetarian options on their menus. Even if they did, those options weren't much different from eating plain vegetables. From that perspective, it made sense, didn't it? After all, people in that world didn't use many spices. Regardless, Helena had changed her perspective after visiting the protagonist's restaurant, and for that, she had to thank Rain for recommending the restaurant. Hearing this, the protagonist realized her first impression of the place had been somewhat subdued. At that moment, the old butcher started yelling, questioning his nephew about what he had said. The nephew revealed that he had discovered his mother wasn't his biological mother. Speaking of her, we transitioned to another location, a sort of mine, where she was searching for him. Approaching one of the workers, she asked where he was, and the worker replied that he didn't know. He mentioned that the night crew had already entered the mine. She was concerned because he hadn't eaten before starting work, and asked the worker if she could deliver his food and return afterward. The worker agreed. Back at the restaurant, the old man was asking where on earth his nephew had heard such a thing. The nephew replied that it didn't matter right now because he had been deceived for 20 years. While this argument was unfolding, the protagonist and Helena were silently listening to everything. The old man began lecturing him, saying that the woman, who was his mother, had worked day and night to ensure he was well fed, even after his father died early while working as a mercenary. That was quite an achievement, even if she wasn't his biological mother. She was smart enough to understand everything on her own, and he knew he was wrong. Still, he had been so upset that when she came to deliver his lunch earlier, he told her he didn't need it. He didn't call her Mom, but rather, Woman. If I were in the old man's shoes, I would have done the same, because that's not something you should say to the woman who raised you. After all, a mother is the one who raises you. Seeing this, the protagonist was already thinking about stepping in, before things escalated further. At that moment, Rain arrived with bad news. She announced that there had been a serious accident in the mine. It had collapsed, and the old man's nephew's mother was trapped inside. The old man, worried, asked how the mine could have collapsed. Rain explained that she didn't know the details but that the mother had entered the mine, looking for Nellen. Hearing this, Nellen began to panic. Desperately, he started running, and seeing this, Helena asked if she could join them. If the mine had collapsed, there would certainly be injuries. With that, the protagonist also decided to go. However, Rain was still hesitant about taking Helena, given everything Helena had previously explained. But since Helena was so determined, she agreed to take them, and shifting the scene to the mine, many people were badly injured. Nellen was arguing with everyone, trying to enter the mine to find his mother. But the protagonist stepped in with authority, telling Nellen he needed to calm down, and that they would find a way to save his mother. Even so, the people there didn't want to let the protagonist enter. After all, the mine was very unstable, and they didn't know when it might collapse again. But the protagonist didn't care and explained that his friend knew healing magic. And since there were likely many injured people inside, she could be of great help. There were many people inside who couldn't move, and with great reluctance, the man allowed them to enter. Helena thanked the protagonist, but she still pointed out that it was extremely dangerous. They were currently on the first floor of the mine. It was indeed unstable, but luckily, the protagonist was a mage and could protect them. Of course, Helena was surprised to learn the protagonist was a mage. He explained that yes, he had been very successful in his younger days but had since retired. Speaking of the past, he wanted to know more about her. He asked why she was living in their village, as he had once had an elf companion. So he knew she wasn't running that clinic just because she was an elf. She had probably faced moments where humans treated her poorly, and yet she decided to enter a nearly collapsing mine to save people. He wanted to know if there was a special reason for this, and just as Helena was about to answer, The protagonist commented that they had a decision to make because, unfortunately, their paths split ahead. Since they didn't have time to search both ways, it was time to use some magic tricks, or rather spirits, to see if they could locate survivors. It worked, and when they found a man, Helena quickly healed him. In their hurry, Helena knew how to perform first aid so he could leave the mine before it collapsed. They continued saving people one by one. While Helena healed them, the protagonist used his magic to move them outside. After some time, seeing Helena's condition, the protagonist asked if she could continue. There was one person left, none other than Nellen's mother. They managed to find her, but she was in critical condition. Helena tried her best to use strong healing magic on her, but there was no guarantee it would work. Even though she was completely exhausted, she managed to cast the spell. Outside, in the temporary evacuation shelter, more and more injured people were arriving, and Rain was deeply worried. She felt powerless and unable to do anything, while the old man tried to comfort her, declaring that Nellen's mother would be okay. He said Helena's magic had worked on her. The person most shocked by everything was none other than Nellen. Noel tried to console him, saying he shouldn't worry, as Helena had used her best spell, so his mother wouldn't be in critical condition. Almost completely drained, Helena confirmed this. She explained that Nellen's mother had suffered a head injury but that the treatment had worked. The wound near her eye wasn't too serious, and she would be able to live normally once the bandages were removed. Looking at the basket beside him, Nellen saw his lunch there. Seeing it reminded him of the moment earlier when he had called his mother "woman." At that moment, May woke up and called out to Nellen. Hearing her voice, he was overwhelmed with happiness, and despite the situation, May asked if he was okay and if he hadn't gotten hurt. He confirmed that he was fine, saying he had been very scared that the words he had said that morning might have been his last to her. May was very happy because he was calling her mother again. Witnessing this, Helena remarked that she would now answer the question the protagonist had asked earlier. In reality, she had wanted to close the clinic and return to her homeland because she had become disappointed in humans after going through many bad experiences there. But then Miss Rain had told her something, to try to increase the number of things she liked. Seeing everything happening now, she thought perhaps she had rushed too quickly to find those things. She also remembered that human lives are much shorter than those of elves. However, humans express their emotions freely, and for that reason, they become disappointed and heartbroken easily. In the end, even elves like her were the same. Ironically, that was one of the reasons she had built her clinic there. She realized there were many things she valued there, making it hard to leave. After all, she enjoyed the honest emotions of humans. And now, she also knew how delicious their food could be. In the end, she had learned a lot, but she was exhausted from using so much magic and started to feel dizzy before collapsing. However, the protagonist caught her, and while she was embarrassed, he was completely clueless about her reaction. Taking advantage of the moment, he used elven mana transfer magic. This surprised her again, and the protagonist explained that he had learned it from his elf friend he had mentioned before. His name was Beaton, and she asked how the protagonist knew him, to which he replied that he used to be a well-known mage. But setting that aside, let's return to the hill beneath the restaurant. There, Rurin was cursing the protagonist because he had left her alone digging holes. Additionally, he had forbidden her from using magic. She was irritated because the protagonist had reprimanded her for trying to recruit a subordinate. Just then, water splashed in her face, or rather, it started gushing from the ground. A while later, the protagonist arrived, already tired, and Rurin explained that water had started coming out of the ground, but the protagonist thought she was just trying to annoy him. Given how irritated and exhausted he was with everything going on, he was skeptical. Later, the protagonist tried digging himself, but he didn't see any water coming out. However, since the ground was damp, there must have been some kind of underground spring nearby. It seemed to be quite deep, so it wasn't visible yet. As the protagonist had mentioned before starting to dig, they needed to cover the ceiling with some kind of barrier to prevent the cave from collapsing. Seeing him invoke all that magic, Rurin remarked that he needed to control his power carefully, or the entire hill might blow up. The protagonist used 8th class magic, but for some reason, he cast flames, which was confusing. After that, he raised the barrier. Honestly, I didn't quite understand what the protagonist was doing here, but the script continued. At that moment, the hole Rurin had dug began gushing water. This wasn't intentional, it happened accidentally. The protagonist realized it was thermal water. Rurin was eager to jump into it, but the protagonist warned her it was too hot. However, his warning came too late. The water splashed onto Rurin, leaving her completely soaked. The protagonist started scolding her, saying she shouldn't throw herself into things recklessly. He also apologized for not warning her sooner that the water was hot. He then began using a shield to block the water source. In fact, he was doing this to create a safe space to collect clean water. The process was something like this. He He would press the ground with the shield, which would naturally adjust the soil to collect clean water. Afterward, he removed the shield, and in the end, he had created a natural bathtub. Then, out of nowhere, he tossed Rurin into it. Naturally, she started yelling that it was too hot, but in reality, it wasn't. The protagonist explained that he had added some cold water beforehand, and so, the two of them enjoyed an ice bath. During this, Rurin expressed her concern for the protagonist. She asked where he had gone earlier, and he explained the entire situation with the mine. But Rurin didn't seem to care about that. She was more worried about the fact that he had gone with the elf. The protagonist said it was necessary since he wasn't very skilled in healing magic. Of course, Rurin's jealousy flared up, and she declared that this must have been why he was so happy. Because while she was digging holes, he had been walking around with a beautiful elf. As the protagonist already knew, her race didn't get along well with elves, and more importantly, she detested everyone except the protagonist. So this was a bit of a low blow for her. Hearing this, the protagonist began preparing something rather unusual, called cocoa. He offered Rurin something she didn't know, and when she tasted it, she found it sweet and delicious. The protagonist explained that it was a fruit called cacao. He also explained the entire process: the cultivation, fermentation, drying, roasting, pressing, and much more, though, of course, he hadn't done all of that himself. He had used his summoning magic. The protagonist then began saying that, despite having very powerful abilities, he wasn't able to save a single injured person in the tunnels without Miss Elf's help, nor could he get simple ingredients for the restaurant without the old man's help. Even though he had used magic to clear the large space for the dragon's lair, one day, he would still need to ask the dwarves to build it properly. The point the protagonist wanted to make was that while different races, abilities, and personalities might exist, that shouldn't be a reason to push others away. After all, even a dragon can't face the world alone. Hearing this, Rurin understood. But even so, she said she would treat the protagonist differently from others because he was special to her. After that, another scene was shown, specifically a battlefield. Ment was with his group, and the battle was intense. They were near a type of hill, and noticing Miltine was too far from the group, Ment yelled at him to fall back since he was too far out. At that moment, someone tried to attack Ment from behind, but the old man was skilled in combat, and quickly disarmed the attacker. He even stabbed him. However, the attacker declared he wouldn't go alone and threw himself off the hill while grabbing Ment. From this point, we don't know what happens next, as the story shifts again. Returning to the protagonist, he was closing the restaurant for the day, and Rurin asked why. The protagonist commented that they had been drinking cocoa the other day, but unfortunately, there was no milk. He had been thinking about building a pen to ensure a steady milk supply, but they didn't have any animals. The protagonist told Rurin not to worry because they would find some. The animal they needed was called Berineric. Since the protagonist needed cows for milk, he asked Rurin to teleport them to the Verdant River, but she said she couldn't do that because she had never been there. The last time she tried teleporting without familiarity, she ended up inside Diarin's castle because of his scent. But the protagonist assured her he would guide her, and, since he was so confident, they decided to try, and they succeeded. Look at all the cows. The protagonist was delighted. The only problem was they were falling from the sky, and Rurin was urging the protagonist to do something. The protagonist asked why she was panicking. She was a dragon, so she could transform and use her wings. Rurin, however, declared that she would never transform into her dragon form. She would rather fall and die. The protagonist asked why she hated her dragon form so much. With a serious expression, she replied that it was none of his business. The protagonist managed to land them safely, but there was still an issue. According to Rurin, the river was incredibly wide. The protagonist corrected her, saying that wasn't a river, it was the sea. Rurin tried to act as if she already knew, claiming she was aware it was the sea, but the protagonist reminded her that she had never seen the ocean before. Since that was the case, he suggested they explore the sea first, and then deal with the cows. Naturally, Rurin agreed. She asked how many cows the protagonist needed, and he said about 10. Rurin immediately proposed another bet. Whoever was slower would have to wash the dishes. The protagonist accepted but forgot that the restaurant was closed, so there would be no dishes to wash. In the end, either of them would win anything. Speaking of the restaurant, his customers were there, starving and pale from hunger. The butcher had been waiting since lunchtime, and the protagonist still hadn't arrived. Diarin mentioned that he had even found a way to sneak out of the castle just to come eat. Meanwhile, Helena had skipped breakfast just to have the pasta. At that exact moment, none other than the protagonist finally arrived. The cows seemed quite happy, but it was because of the dragon's mental manipulation. Either way, there were enough of them. Later, the protagonist planned to build a barn for the cows to sleep in, but first, he needed to open the restaurant. The problem was that when he arrived, he saw a disaster in front of the door, and he felt a bit embarrassed about it. Some time later, everyone was eating heartily, and seeing this, the protagonist asked what would have happened if he hadn't returned that day. Would they have waited until the next day? The old man replied that, in that case, he probably would have had to dig 3 graves next to the restaurant. The old man then asked where the protagonist had gone, and he explained that he had been fetching those cows, saying he wanted to stock up on milk. Hearing this, the old man asked how he planned to manage those Berineric cows since the restaurant was already short on staff. The protagonist responded that it was obvious, he would need to hire more employees. Managing the pasture would require constant supervision, so he couldn't hire just anyone. He would have to schedule job interviews. The old man, slightly intrigued, told the protagonist not to worry about it. After all, elves have the ability to read people's intentions. This skill was important for young Master Detran to differentiate the good from the bad. Additionally, the old man had met many people during his time as a mercenary. Since they had made the protagonist work on his day off, they would help him with the hiring process as a gesture of gratitude. So, he shouldn't worry about the interviews. They assured him they would choose excellent employees for him. The next day, they posted a notice on the city's bulletin board, and interviews for pasture management began. Rurin asked the protagonist if this was all part of a process to recruit useful subordinates. He explained that it was something similar. But anyway, it was time to begin, and the first guy barely arrived said, "Good morning," and already failed. The man didn't understand why, as he had just entered, but the old man commented that he lacked energy for someone so young. How could someone without energy take care of cows? The second candidate probably overheard this and entered with great enthusiasm, declaring that he would do his best to take care of the cows. Seeing this, the old man thought he might be useful, but the man started looking at Helena with ulterior motives. At that moment, Helena declared that he had failed. She explained to the old man that the candidate had impure thoughts, and in the end, he was also dismissed. The third candidate seemed more promising. He began by saying he had 30 years of experience, and promised to make the protagonist's pasture the best in Drake. This time, Diran did the questioning. He asked the man about his thoughts on the well-being of the Berineric cows, but the man didn't understand. Diran then bombarded him with questions, asking how he would care for the Berineric to ensure they produced more milk. From there, the questioning became so intense that the candidate dropped his pipe on the ground. Detran was doing all this because he was a baron who cared about the cows as much as his citizens. For that reason, they couldn't be taken lightly. The man eventually left, saying everyone there was crazy. After witnessing these interviews, the protagonist started losing hope. Rurin commented that she hadn't realized how hard it was to find a good subordinate. But from that point on, to summarize, things only went downhill. Candidates barely arrived before being bombarded with failures. For example, one was dismissed simply because of his eyes. Of course, there were other reasons, but they weren't even worth mentioning. Watching all this, the protagonist was practically dying of laughter. The interviews were going so poorly that by the end, there weren't any candidates left. The protagonist sat in a corner, lamenting the missed opportunity. At that moment, another candidate arrived. It was none other than Miltine, who told the protagonist she had seen the job notice and asked if she could start working there. The old butcher asked what she was doing there. For those who didn't know, Miltine was a woman. The old man remembered her being on an escort mission. She explained that Ment had been seriously injured and clarified that they were attacked by bandits during the mission. Ment fell off a cliff trying to help her, and the old man was already irritated because Ment hadn't told him any of this. Setting that aside, he asked how Ment was doing, and she replied that he was badly injured. However, now he was left with a limp, which meant he would have to retire from mercenary work. The protagonist even tried to ask Helena if she could do something, but since too much time had passed since the injury, she couldn't do anything to reverse it. At best, she could check on him. Then Rurin asked the much-anticipated question, why was Miltine applying for the job, when it was Ment who got injured? Faced with this, the protagonist scolded her harshly, telling her to learn to read the room. However, Rurin was just curious, since it seemed clear that Miltine had also quit being a mercenary, likely following Ment's lead. Moreover, she was now applying to work at the restaurant. Embarrassed, Miltine began explaining that she was looking for work, where she and Ment could work together. Hearing this, the old man was shocked. First, he asked how old she was turning this year, and she replied that she was 29. The old man yelled that there was a 13-year age difference between them, but Miltine defended herself, saying age was just a number. Hearing this, Helena remarked that she didn't understand why they were so alarmed, since, for elves, a 13-year age gap was practically the same age. Even Rurin agreed with her, but for humans, it was a significant difference. Nonetheless, Miltine declared she had already made up her mind. She had stopped being a mercenary, and if they didn't let her work there, she'd starve on the streets. Rurin accepted her, saying she liked her determination and that the age difference truly didn't matter. With that, Miltine was hired. Naturally, the protagonist was happy to have her and Ment working for him. The only issue was that Ment wasn't there, so they didn't have his opinion on the matter. Miltine declared that she would tell him, after they got started and filled the first bottle of milk working there. After all, he was the one who taught her how to handle a sword, from holding it to taking care of her weapons. Of course, working on the pasture would be difficult, but she wanted to learn to be self-sufficient. Afterward, she wanted to show Ment how things were done there. Hearing this, Helena was deeply moved, saying it was a strong determination in the name of love, a beautiful passion. Hearing that, Diran commented that those probably weren't the right words for the moment. But changing the subject, about filling the first bottle of milk, the protagonist thought of the perfect dish to prepare for Ment's visit. Regardless, he was happy to work with Miltine. The next day, Miltine called the protagonist boss. This confused him, but of course, he was now her boss, so he should assign her tasks. Since that was the case, he asked her to take the cows out to graze, and she quickly agreed, starting to approach one of them. She was surprised they weren't aggressive, and even wondered what kind of magic had been used to make them so docile. However, she was so bad at handling cattle that just the cow turning its head caused her to fall. But she wasn't going to give up. After all, it wouldn't be fun if it were too easy. She tried brute force, but it didn't work. She tried approaching from a different angle, but that didn't work either. She even tried scaring the cow, but as expected, that didn't work. The protagonist tried giving her some advice, saying that wild Birinerics are very restless, so she didn't need to stop their hooves, but she should check them regularly, since they were domesticating them. Still, Miltine couldn't manage it. The next day, the protagonist asked her to prepare the hay. She was to turn it occasionally so it wouldn't stay damp on one side. The problem was that she still couldn't handle the cattle. Once again, she was thrown to the ground. Days passed, and nothing was going right. Pasturing, trimming hooves, and she didn't even manage to milk the cows. At first, she was confident, but now, she was already feeling discouraged, and she was afraid of being fired before even working with Mint. However, at that moment, the cows started approaching her in a very gentle manner, which surprised her. This meant the cows probably accepted her, so it also meant she could milk them. And sometime later, she approached the protagonist declaring that she had finally gotten the milk. The protagonist was even more surprised because he thought it would take at least a week. In any case, since she managed it, he decided to start preparing a dish. Then he asked her to change clothes, and when she asked what kind of dish it would be, the protagonist replied it would be a pizza, topped with lots of cheese. The steps for the protagonist to make this were as follows. First, he pasteurized the milk at a low temperature for 30 minutes, then reduced the heat. He added vinegar to coagulate the milk. It would have been easier with rennet, but they couldn't do much about it. After coagulation, he removed the curds, leaving the whey behind. Since Miltine didn't know much about this, she asked why the milk separated, but the protagonist didn't explain it very well. He simply declared that he would work with what he had now. After placing it in salted water, he stretched the curds after dipping them in warm water. During this process, he removed the air and any remaining whey. Then he shaped it, and voila, mozzarella cheese was ready. Miltine was a bit confused because that cheese was different from what she knew. He explained that it was indeed different. This cheese was meant to be placed on bread and baked. After all, for her confession, she needed a special gift, right? Hearing this, she blushed entirely. In truth, she hadn't even thought about that. However, this could be an opportunity, couldn't it? But the protagonist, playing tough, commented that she could trust him. After all, when he was younger, all kinds of women used to follow him around. At that moment, Miltine asked if he had experience with dating, but he replied that he didn't, because they all ran away shortly after. However, one thing he was sure of, sincerity always works. That's why she should pour her sincere feelings into this, and surely Mr. Mint would acknowledge her. Sometime later, they went to Mint. When he opened the door, he was quite shocked, because there were the protagonist looking relaxed, Helena calm, and the old butcher completely irritated. He immediately asked why on earth he didn't tell him what had happened. While the group entered the house, in the back, there was Miltine feeling utterly embarrassed. Inside, the old butcher was ranting, but Mint declared he would wait a little and then tell them. At that point, the protagonist introduced Helena to Mint, and he recognized her since she was quite famous. However, Mint wanted to know how he found out about his wound because there was no way he could know unless he had been in the same group of mercenaries, or someone from the group had told them. And just then, who arrived? None other than Miltine. This surprised the old butcher there. And some time later, Helena applied first aid to Mint, and he even felt a little better. But that was all Helena could do for the moment. At this point, he turned his attention to Miltine, asking if she had anything else to say. Hearing this, she was utterly confused, not knowing what to do, and realized it was more awkward than she expected. Meanwhile, the old butcher and the protagonist were trying to support her from a distance. Faced with this, she asked him if he wasn't hungry. And if he wasn't it time to eat first? Meanwhile, in her mind, she declared that she needed to calm down a bit and do as she had learned. Sincerity always works, and she would show her sincerity through food and her companions. If the old butcher didn't notice, he wouldn't just be blind but pretending not to see. Then, Miltine explained that this was a dish called pizza, and she made it, although the protagonist helped. But the old butcher had no tact at all. He didn't even let her finish speaking and already grabbed a slice of pizza. That hurt her quite a bit, right? But the protagonist started explaining that this was cheese, which surprised Mint. As far as he remembered, cheese was a smelly chunk sold at the corner of the market. But unfortunately, that was just spoiled milk. And at the moment he took the first bite, he noticed that the cheese was quite different, and already next to Miltine. She realized that communicating through food had failed, and sometime after eating the entire pizza, Mint was praising Miltine, because she had made a very delicious meal. But at that moment, Miltine interrupted him, asking what he had decided to do in the future. Mint replied that he was still thinking about it, and Miltine quickly struck, asking if he didn't want to work with her on the protagonist's farm. Mint was confused because he didn't know the protagonist had a farm. She explained it was new, and Miltine was already working there. This caught Mint by surprise as he wondered about her mercenary work. She responded that she had quit after he left, and when the old butcher asked why, she began to sweat, thinking she needed to show her sincerity, and then she declared, because she wanted to stay by his side in the future. Hearing this, Mint was somewhat confused, but the audience, holding their breath, was completely anxious. At that moment, Mint began to say, "The farm, huh? Then I guess I'll have to put effort into my rehabilitation." Hearing this, Miltine was very happy, which meant he had accepted her feelings. Mint continued, saying, he was glad she was working on the farm because now she would at least have time to find a boyfriend. Then the old butcher began explaining why, saying she probably wouldn't have a relationship working as a mercenary, and now that she was older, she should try meeting some men in the city. He even turned to the protagonist, asking when he should start working, but the protagonist was shocked by the situation. He declared that Mint could start whenever he wanted after rehabilitation, but internally, he was apologizing to Miltine, thinking she would succeed, and it seemed that, in the end, sincerity didn't always work. After they were leaving, the protagonist commented to her that she didn't need to feel so down because they would have plenty of time since they'd be working together. Miltine replied that she wasn't upset, because, as the protagonist himself had said, she would have many opportunities in the future. Either way, she was leaving. But, as we already know, she wasn't fine, and even so, she declared that she would never give up, and the old butcher was already somewhat upset. He knew Mint lived with his head in the clouds, but not to this extent. The protagonist also felt bad, but the old butcher was still very upset because, after all that, how did men not understand? At this, Helena declared that it really didn't make sense, because even after Miltine did all that, it still didn't make sense. And speaking of Mint, word taken to him, and apparently, he did understand, and even commented on what he was going to do next. But leaving this romantic matter aside, let's move to another location where some important people were being received, and it was none other than the Prince of the Luvan Empire, named Leon Horace. He commented that the place was quite peaceful, while the women who saw him were saying how wonderful he was. They were completely smitten with him, and of course, he didn't miss the opportunity to talk to them. A little ahead of him were two people. The first was the Imperial Duke Porgo Tamirin, and the hooded woman was the head of the mages, Medrin, and she remarked that the prince probably wanted those two girls at the castle tonight. The Duke commented that the prince was quite daring but let him have his fun. After all, there was no problem with that. Back at the Duke's house, Diran was preparing to receive these people. He asked where his mother was, and the butler replied that she wasn't feeling well, so in that case, Diran would have to receive them alone, which made sense since his mother was ill. He was the legitimate representative of the city of Grake, and every word he spoke would represent the city. Thus, he should not forget that. As he entered the room, the Duke immediately scolded him, saying he was late, and Prince Leon was already laughing at Diran, but internally, Diran was trying to stay focused, hoping his father would illuminate him with his wisdom, and so Duke Porgo asked Diran if his father was well, and Diran replied no, as he was still bedridden. Leon commented that, as far as he remembered, the Count was close to Marquis Saran. Diran confirmed this. It had been some time since they last saw each other, which made sense because the Marquis was also in poor health. Out of nowhere, Porgo made a comment, asking if it wasn't time for the owner to change, but Diran didn't quite understand Porgo's question. Porgo continued, saying that he should join him because he could provide good protection for the territory of the city of Grake, and that way, he wouldn't have to deal with politics. After thinking for a moment, Diran declared that this was something he couldn't answer at the moment, and Porgo set it aside for now, wanting to talk about something else. It was the large-scale flood prevention plan and the civil war happening in neighboring kingdoms. Because of all this, they would have to increase taxes in the city of Grake and other fiefs. Concerned, Diran asked if this was the capital's official plan, to which Porgo replied that it didn't matter, because regardless, it was his duty to take care of his territory. But of course, if he were to accept his earlier offer, things could be a bit different. Or was that also difficult to answer? And it was normal for a baron to be pressured with different choices, whether good or bad. He had to make a decision because doing nothing was not an option. But due to all this pressure, Diran started saying that he would prepare a dinner for them, and at dinner, he would give an answer. At first, Porgo didn't quite understand, but Prince Leon found the idea quite interesting, because he was already looking for things to do until dinner. However, could Diran satisfy someone who had dined at the royal palace? He confirmed that he could because the city of Grake had an incredible restaurant. Speaking of that restaurant, the protagonist was inviting Miltine to lunch. Today's menu was fried rice, and Rurin, seeing her plate, asked why her portion was smaller than usual. The protagonist replied that he had made enough for her to have seconds. But just at that moment, someone barged in, kicking the door wide open, and it was none other than a knight. However, the protagonist didn't like his attitude. The knight, already unsheathing his sword, asked the protagonist if he was the owner of the restaurant, and he confirmed he was. But he asked the knight to put away his sword. The knight, however, didn't like that much, saying he was following orders and that the protagonist should know his place. The protagonist replied that he knew who they were, and they weren't the best order of knights in the empire. With her mouth full of food, Rurin asked the protagonist if she should handle it, to which he replied yes, because if she did, it would lead to a fight. And when the protagonist asked the knight again to lower his sword, he simply pointed it at the protagonist, saying he didn't understand what was happening there, and that he should kneel, or it would be the last day he saw the sun. At that, the protagonist gave his final warning. He told them to leave the restaurant, or something very bad would happen. But just as the knight was about to strike with his sword, out of nowhere, someone shouted for him to stop, questioning who had asked him to do that. And when the protagonist heard that shout, he recognized a familiar voice. It was none other than the first vice-commander of the Knight's Order, Diriant Abra. Apparently, he recognized the protagonist. Abra apologized to the protagonist, saying he had done this because he feared the protagonist would disappear once again, so he sent his knights first. However, he hadn't expected it to go so wrong. The protagonist said it was fine and asked how long it had been since he became the first vice-commander. He replied that it had been about 5 years. Speaking in a tone of humility, the protagonist asked him not to act that way. After all, he had left the army a long time ago. Yet Abra still hadn't forgotten that day, when they were losing due to a miscalculation on his part. That was when the protagonist arrived and defeated all the monsters, bringing them victory. The protagonist said it wasn't that glorious. He had only been able to do it because Abra held his position until the end, fighting with his life and those of his subordinates at risk. And to make matters worse, in the end, he even refused an award and asked to be punished instead, which, to Abra, made sense since the honor of a knight is everything. Anyway, during all this time, he had no idea how difficult his wife's daily life was. And after he heard about it, he felt as if he'd been struck on the head, because he had only been thinking about himself and his honor. So much so that he hadn't considered or cared for the person closest to him. And saying it like that might make it seem like his wife had died. But no, remember that the protagonist wanted to give him a reward? So, he ended up sending the reward money to his wife. Knowing this, Abra felt very grateful, and he started thinking about how he could return the favor. There wasn't much he could do, since the protagonist had left the army. But then he found out the protagonist had opened a restaurant, and he came up with an idea. Shut down every restaurant in the city of Grake except his. That way, his restaurant could become the best, and he immediately began putting the plan into action. The protagonist tried to stop him, but he was too fast. Switching scenes, now we move to where Porgo and Leon were. Porgo was asking the prince if he was really going to a restaurant to enjoy dinner. Leon agreed, as the Baron of the city of Grake personally guaranteed that he would be surprised by the food. However, Porgo was concerned about His Majesty's safety, so he suggested summoning the First Order of Knights to provide an escort. But the prince couldn't do that, as he had already told them they were free until dinner time, so he couldn't go back on his word. Besides, there was no need to worry with that person nearby. And as he said this, the arrows that were flying toward him stopped midair. And there was the reason he wasn't worried. Medrin was by his side. Porgo asked who was shooting at them, and they were merely demanding the prince be handed over. With that, there was no need to listen to them any further. It was time for Medrin to take action. The bandits, upon seeing her, realized things were about to get ugly, and they quickly attacked her. But I guess they didn't recognize her, and out of nowhere, she raised a series of earth pillars, uprooting trees with their roots intact. After all the destruction Medrin caused, the prince was very happy to have someone like her by his side. After all, she was the most powerful mage in the empire, and with her by his side, even dragons would fear them. Though one of the bandits survived, Prince Leon declared she could forget about him. After all, even if they tried interrogating him, he would just say he couldn't reveal anything or that it was his own decision. So, she did as ordered. Witnessing this, Diran was deeply shocked because the rumors were true. The only 7th class Archmage capable of facing an entire army alone. Meanwhile, back with the protagonist, he managed to catch Abra. Abra admitted he had a weakness. Every time he got excited, he would just run off without looking back. To the protagonist, this didn't make much sense, as someone as intelligent as Abra shouldn't make such foolish mistakes. To tease him a bit more, the protagonist ordered him to stand at attention and began lecturing him, saying he would shut down the restaurants. That wasn't an idea befitting a knight, and he questioned Abra about how he planned to close the other restaurants. Abra replied that he would spread a rumor about insects in their food, which, to be fair, was quite creative. But it wasn't something a knight should do. At that moment, something caught Abra's attention, and he ordered everyone to stand at attention. From a distance, the prince was approaching, and the prince remarked that he hadn't expected to see Abra there, to which Abra apologized. But as far as Abra remembered, the prince was supposed to stay at the castle until dinner. The prince confirmed this but explained that he'd heard about a great restaurant nearby, so he decided to check it out personally. Of course, he didn't come alone. The prince then turned his attention to the protagonist and asked if he was the restaurant owner, and he replied affirmatively. Seeing the Empire's prince standing before him, the protagonist understood why the first order of knights was in the city of Grake. Besides, there was that woman behind him, and the prince noticed the protagonist was wearing the ancient imperial mage's attire. The protagonist explained that he had served in the Mage Legion for a while and only wore the uniform for comfort, but he was retired now. Hearing this, the prince was pleased. He declared that if the protagonist had been a mage, then he must know her, his little girl named Medrin. After all, she was a 7th class mage, so if he had been in the Legion, he would certainly recognize her. Since the prince wanted them to meet, he called for her, telling Medrin to come meet her junior. Porgo, seeing the prince's reaction, remarked that he was being overly dramatic. But on Medrin's side, she was breaking out in a cold sweat. Stammering, she said the protagonist's name. Seeing her reaction, Porgo asked if she was all right, because if she was overwhelmed, she could rest. But she replied that she was fine. Approaching the two, she asked for permission to speak. The prince asked her if she knew the protagonist. That question caught her off guard because she had to be very careful. If she messed things up, everyone there could be in danger. The protagonist was the first to speak, saying that they probably didn't know each other. Then he introduced himself, and Medrin followed his lead, saying she didn't know him either and that it was a pleasure to meet him. The prince was a bit puzzled, as she was quite powerful, yet the protagonist didn't recognize her. But Medrin understood what the protagonist was trying to do. He was putting on this act to avoid causing any problems. Therefore, she needed to keep things as normal as possible. She then started saying that the restaurant would offer a dinner for His Royal Highness, and that it should be a great honor for a mere cook. Thus, he should prepare the meal immediately. Annoyed, the protagonist said he would do it and ensure the guests were satisfied. A little while later, inside the restaurant, the prince commented that the interior was cleaner than he had expected, which wasn't bad for a common restaurant. The protagonist replied that he hadn't expected such a distinguished crowd, so he apologized in advance if anything fell short. Hearing this, the prince said the protagonist shouldn't worry. After all, the only thing that matters in a restaurant is the food. With that, the protagonist asked him a question, as based on what he had mentioned earlier, he had heard that the restaurant served food that would surprise even the crown prince. The prince replied that it was because the representative of the city of Grake had assured him of this with such confidence. For this reason, he was so eager. Hearing this, the protagonist understood the overall situation, which meant his peaceful retirement had been interrupted. And since Diren's father was ill, the city was in an unstable position because they were caught in the middle of a power struggle. And, as Diren was unable to resist the pressure, he had come back to the protagonist for help, all because of that man over there. The protagonist knew that Duke Porgo was among the top 3 in the palace, when it came to lust for power. Speaking of him, the prince remarked that he needed a proper dish for a man. After all, he had a lot of work to do that night. Hearing this, the protagonist declared in his mind that he wouldn't let this go. Turning back to the prince, he commented that he wanted to do something a little different. Or rather, he wanted to make a bet whether the restaurant could truly surprise him with a dish. If Diren lost, he would have to strip off his clothes and run back home naked. After all, if he trusted that establishment so much, he shouldn't refuse, right? With that, the protagonist declared he would bring the food. Or rather, a dish that would surprise him, meaning the bet was accepted. But the problem was finding the right dish, because the crown prince had probably tasted every kind of dish in the empire. So, the protagonist began with appetizers, starting with a lamb mushroom soup. The protagonist knew that surprising someone with such a dish wouldn't be an easy task. The prince began praising the protagonist's dish. However, it wasn't enough to surprise him, because he had already eaten plenty of this kind of mushroom soup at the castle. Duke Porgo shared the same opinion, but the protagonist wanted to hear what others thought. Internally, he had already found a solution to this problem. He needed someone's help, someone who couldn't refuse any of his requests. And inside the plate, it was even written, "Please give me a warm answer," which completely shattered Medrin's dignity. She ate the dish trembling with fear and stood up, saying that the soup was very delicious. The texture and flavor were incredibly powerful. It was almost as if the mushrooms were growing inside her stomach. And if you were to compare it to the world of magic, it was certainly 7th class. No, even 9th class. Which, for those who didn't understand, means the protagonist is of 9th class. She was sort of trying to send a subtle message, and the protagonist was laughing a lot at her. Meanwhile, Dairon wasn't understanding anything, and to keep up the act, Medrin asked for another dish. Hearing this, the prince was a bit puzzled, saying that since Medrin was saying such things, he would try the soup again. Even Dairon took another spoonful, but he didn't notice such a big difference. Of course, the soup was delicious, and if it weren't for the uncomfortable atmosphere, he would have been tempted to ask for another bowl too. But Medrin's reaction was a bit exaggerated. There was no way a palace mage had never tried mushroom soup with lamb before. So, he wanted to know what or who could force a 7th class mage to do such a thing. That's when he began wondering if, in reality, it was the protagonist. Returning to the prince, he commented that he didn't see much of a difference compared to the palace food. At this, Porgo declared that since she liked lamb soup so much, he would remember it and add it to her diet when they returned to the palace. But Medrin declared that this one was different from the others. She then began shoveling spoonful after spoonful, but nearing the end of the dish, there was another phrase written. The protagonist was asking her to go to the back of the restaurant once she finished eating, which was another blow to her. Thus, she did as the protagonist instructed and went to meet him. But she was trembling with fear, and just as she was about to say something, the protagonist cast a soundproofing spell. Then he began to say it had been a long time since they last saw each other, and that she had improved a lot since the last time they met. But she shouldn't have done that, though it was a pleasure to see her. However, he had already warned her back then that they should never meet again. In shock, Medrin declared it wasn't her fault. She had no idea he lived there. At this, the protagonist asked why she was there. She answered it was because of Duke Porgo, as he traveled to small estates to increase his influence within the palace. However, the protagonist wasn't interested in the Duke. He wanted to know about the Crown Prince, because as far as he remembered, he had the worst reputation. According to rumors, he was so lascivious that he was depraved, with no interest in power, and from what he heard today, those rumors seemed to be true. A person like that, being the Crown Prince, who only thought of pleasure, was a man pretending not to be authoritarian. But he knew how to use his position to his advantage, because, from what the protagonist noticed, he was using his debauched image as a shield, pressuring Baron Grake as if it were a joke. And of course, he thought that devouring the city of Grake was Duke Porgo's idea. But in truth, it seemed that this was the true goal of the Crown Prince. Therefore, the protagonist wanted to know why they were really there, but Medrin declared she couldn't say, not even if he tortured her. At that moment, someone else joined the conversation, declaring that they should indeed torture her, to test whether she would talk or not. Upon seeing Rurin there, Medrin fell to her knees, declaring she wanted to go home. Sometime later, Medrin returned inside. Both the prince and the duke were a bit surprised, questioning if she was okay, and she replied that she was. But we already know she wasn't. She declared that she was just enjoying the brilliance of the soup, and the prince commented that he didn't expect to find such a delicious soup in that place. And perhaps, deep in his heart, Mr. Grake was excited about the wager. But he asked what the terms of the wager were, and Duke Porgo replied that they should serve a dish that would impress the prince. Hearing this, the prince began laughing, declaring he wasn't in the mood to be impressed today. And if it were a normal day, that soup probably would have impressed him. But today, he needed to win a bet. And of course, he wasn't foolish enough not to realize the stakes. This meant he wouldn't be surprised even if Dairon's father, who was ill, stood up and started cooking for him. However, if he could hear the answer he was waiting for, his mood might change. So, wasn't it time for him to give his answer? Dairon began to respond, saying that being a lord was a position of responsibility. He could endure his own personal misfortune, but to torment the people of the kingdom, just to set aside that misfortune for a moment was something he couldn't do, and above all, he believed in that restaurant. That's why they should proceed with their bet. And of course, if he lost, he would strip off his clothes and run through the city of Grake. Hearing this, the prince had to wait, and by late afternoon, the protagonist had finished the dish. He placed the tray on the table, and the prince commented that the protagonist was probably confident. Since there was so much at stake with that dish, the protagonist declared that he was, and the moment he uncovered the dish, there was a piece of earth, or more specifically, it was a baked clay shell, and Porgo was already irritated, questioning if the protagonist was asking them to eat dirt. But of course, that wasn't it. The protagonist broke the clay shell. When that piece of hardened earth opened, there were several leaves inside. And within those leaves, there was a beautiful and exquisite chicken, which, for them, was the palenque, and it surprised the prince. The prince even asked the protagonist how he had managed it. And of course, the protagonist didn't answer. He simply explained that they usually just cook the palenque. But since His Highness was there, he made a little extra effort. And while the dish might seem like a trivial lump of clay on the outside, to an outsider, they might question what kind of dish it was. That's because it's hidden for the sake of surprise. They can't discern its nature because they don't know what the dish truly looks like. Once the awkward clay is removed, there is a deeply flavorful palenque underneath. But hearing this, the prince was a bit unsettled. He asked the protagonist what he was trying to imply. To this, the protagonist replied that it was nothing. It was just that the dish carried a profound meaning about mass destitution of the central nobility to strengthen royal power. In short, it was somewhat similar to a prince playing the fool. Hearing this, everyone at the table was utterly shocked, and the protagonist continued by saying it was clear. Just like that dish, he would probably be cast out if he were defeated, wouldn't he? And so, the protagonist began to describe the general situation of the Luvan Empire. First, it lost control of the city of Grake due to the war against the dragons. After the war, the empire could only consolidate its power in a few cities. As a result, the empire's power was quite weak. Taking advantage of this moment of weakness, the crown prince found a way to survive. The method he used was to spread his authority. Look at me. I don't want any more power. I'm completely harmless. And all I want is to drink and have some women by my side. So leave me alone. That was one of the phrases the prince used. Of course, this was just the protagonist's interpretation. However, upon hearing this, Duke Porgo was already quite outraged, asking the protagonist if he even realized what he was saying. Nevertheless, the protagonist asked them to listen a bit more, as the most interesting part was coming. The crown prince's behavior was actually a facade to regain his lost reign. He secretly and gradually gathered his troops and prepared for a counterattack against the nobles. However, what might happen if the protagonist's thoughts spread around? Hearing this, Porgo couldn't contain himself. He called for Duriant, who quickly entered the restaurant. At that point, Duke Porgo declared that the protagonist was saying some very interesting things. But from now on, that restaurant would cease to exist. Faced with this, Duriant was in a tough spot. He didn't know whether to follow the order and go after the protagonist or refuse it. At that moment, the protagonist questioned Duke Porgo if he really thought getting rid of him would work. But hearing this, Porgo exploded again and this time, ordered Medrin to make the protagonist kneel. And she declared, trembling with fear, that she couldn't do it. At that moment, the Duke couldn't understand what was happening, but the protagonist declared that the Duke should realize the situation he was in. Just as the Duke was about to give the protagonist a piece of his mind, out of nowhere, the prince began eating the food with enthusiasm. This surprised everyone at the table, and he even declared that the food was very delicious, asking the others why they weren't eating. After all, if they just sat there, the food would get cold, and while the Duke wanted to say something, the prince told him to shut up and eat. So, the Duke took a bite. Then the prince asked him what he thought. The Duke replied that it was delicious, but the prince wanted to know if he wasn't surprised. Faced with this, the Duke declared that it was incredibly delicious. And thus, they reached a conclusion. The crown prince lost the bet, so he congratulated the Baron of Grake. The bet was all his, and he even thanked the protagonist for the meal, but it was time to leave. However, the protagonist asked if he wasn't waiting for a response from the Baron of Grake. The prince explained that he only planned to stay for one day and besides, he had already heard the Baron of Grake's answer. Therefore, he wouldn't bother him any further, and after everyone left, the protagonist began sweating nervously, saying that it worked out in the end. At least they won the bet. Dairan thanked the protagonist, but he still didn't understand what had happened and asked who the hell the protagonist was to pull all of that off. The protagonist simply replied that he was just a cook. Furthermore, he added that he couldn't say Dairan shouldn't worry about such external pressure, as long as he was there. Anyway, now that all the rich people were gone, it was time to eat, and they left half the chicken behind. Switching back to the rich folk, the atmosphere was quite tense, and at that moment, the prince turned to Medrin, asking if that cook was the person she always talked about. She confirmed, which surprised the duke. The prince was somewhat astonished, as, according to Medrin, there was a man that even nobles and knights couldn't disrespect. But Porgo was still a bit shocked because they had Medrin and the cavalry on their side. So, wasn't it the perfect time to get rid of him? But the prince agreed they could. However, that wasn't the only reason he left, and he began rethinking the way they were increasing their power, pressuring the Templars and using Medrin to break their necks. He started reconsidering after hearing Diran declare his faith in that establishment. Reflecting on that, the prince even wondered if, despite the situation, he would have the courage to continue the bet. Or rather, could he trust his life and reputation to a civilian? And for that reason, they needed to start from the beginning. But this time, they should go a bit slower to build trust. After all, that was the best approach, wasn't it? Because if they continued on their current path, they'd likely end up walking the streets. The next day, the protagonist declared that he had finally finished. The thing he had completed was the barn for the Birineric. But the moment one of the Birineric touched it, the structure simply collapsed. Which, eventually, was bound to happen. And then Rurin explained that they would have died if they had been inside. The protagonist was a bit sad because he had tried to build the place without any knowledge of architecture. But then the question arose, how did the protagonist manage to construct the restaurant? At this, the protagonist admitted that he had only given the basic idea to the builders, and they did the rest of the restaurant. In any case, he would need to do some research, and logically that meant going where the best architects lived. So, it was time to meet the dwarves. Changing locations, now in the Miliarek Mountains, inside a certain treasure-filled mountain. A red-haired woman declared that she felt an unexpected aura. It seemed like someone of her race was approaching, and this red-haired girl was, in fact, a red dragon. Her name was Serena, and she declared that she should make sure he knew whose territory he was entering. She was a bit irritated because there weren't any humans around to offer her tributes. She was bored, but it was time to torment them a bit. Serena was saying all of this with such a firm voice, but she ended up tripping over a crown lying around, and it seemed to hurt quite a bit, didn't it? Changing the scene, the protagonist and Rurin were arriving at the mountain. She complained, saying she didn't like mountains, and besides, couldn't the protagonist just hire a human architect? However, the protagonist explained that it wasn't possible, because no one surpasses dwarves when it comes to creating things. Hearing this, Rurin started to feel hopeful. The protagonist said they were probably close, as, from what he remembered, their village was nearby. But when they arrived, it was completely destroyed. The statues were all broken, and the gate had no doors. This didn't make sense to the protagonist because there was no way they would leave the place in such a state. To make things worse, when he looked inside, there were numerous corpses everywhere. Seeing this, Rurin asked who could have done something like that. At that moment, Serena appeared, declaring she had expected to find someone more powerful. But it turned out to be just a little kid from her race, which was quite disappointing. Even worse, she was accompanied by a human. At that moment, the human asked Serena if she was the one who did it. This startled Serena, questioning how a human dared to speak to her, but the protagonist demanded she answer. This made Serena furious, declaring that he was just an insect, therefore he should die. With that, she used her dragon breath. Rurin told the protagonist he wouldn't be able to defend against it without a barrier. However, he had already raised one. With just a movement of his magic, he absorbed the dragon breath. This, of course, shocked Serena. The protagonist then used a power called Plasma Break, which struck Serena squarely in the stomach. She began to wonder who the protagonist was, but looking more closely at his face, she remembered him as the one who had annihilated her entire race in the last war. For the third time, the protagonist asked the question, and if she didn't answer, this time, he would escalate things. Serena begged for mercy, as she already knew that magic would kill her. She started apologizing for trying to pick a fight with the protagonist. She explained that she had only arrived there recently, but when she did, there were no dwarves there anymore. That's why she hadn't received any tributes from the humans. She had seen the massive closed gate but hadn't gotten close enough to examine it. The protagonist asked what gate she was talking about. At that moment, Serena saw an opportunity, declaring that if the protagonist wanted to know how to get there, she could guide him. After all, it would be much more fun to walk with her than to stick with that brat. But at that moment, Rurin kicked her, saying the protagonist was hers and that Serena should just explain where the gate was. Serena then explained that it was farther down, deeper, on the lowest floor. Back in the city of Drake, Diaran's mother was having a conversation with him. He explained everything that had happened so far with the crown prince's situation. Then Diaran mentioned he had heard that his mother was unwell. He asked if she was okay. The person he was talking to was his mother, Berna Greek. She replied that she was fine. However, Diaran was still a bit worried because she hadn't eaten her dessert. As on previous occasions, he asked if she didn't like the food. She replied that wasn't the case, so he didn't need to worry. But this was still troubling for Diran. Later, in Diran's father's room, Berna said she couldn't stand the suffocating situation anymore. That mansion felt more like the walls of a prison. Even the dessert tasted like sand to her. She asked Baron Greek if he could hear her. She said she couldn't take it anymore, that every second spent with Diran was torment. Back to the protagonist's side. Inside the cave, there was a large city below. But apart from the ruins, the only things they saw were corpses. From the destruction marks in the city, it looked like it was caused by a dragon, so they might have to deal with Serena forcefully. However, the protagonist declared that it didn't seem like something a dragon would have done. They arrived at the gate Serena had mentioned. The gate bore many marks and appeared very sturdy, and pushing it didn't seem like it would open it, so breaking it might be the best option. But at that moment, a voice came from the orb in the center of the gate, telling them to stop, declaring that they, wanderers, were not welcome in that place. From the voice, the protagonist realized it was one of the dwarves, and he asked what the hell had happened there. The dwarf replied that a red dragon had brought destruction to that place. But Rurin was already irritated because it was almost certain that Serena was that red dragon. However, the protagonist managed to calm her down, saying they needed to hear the whole story first. The problem was that even the dwarf didn't know if it was really the red dragon. Still, Rurin was furious, insisting it was definitely Serena who did it, and that if they didn't deal with her soon, the dwarves probably wouldn't open the gate. That's why they needed to knock Serena out with a punch. But once again, the protagonist asked her to calm down, because he had a plan. After all, as she already knew, he preferred to resolve things peacefully. The protagonist then asked how long the gate had been closed. The dwarf behind it replied that it had been a year, and since it had been such a long time, it wouldn't be surprising if so many problems occurred during that period. However, what worried the protagonist most was their food supply, so he asked if there was really a problem letting him in. He explained that he wanted to help them, but the dwarf remained skeptical. How could he prove that none of them were subordinates of the red dragon? Rurin was already irritated, claiming there was no way they would ever serve that ugly red dragon. The protagonist had to cover her mouth again, declaring that he would respect the dwarf's decision. Then he asked Rurin to grab the backpack. Out of nowhere, he lit a fire and began preparing food. The dwarf asked what the hell he was doing. The protagonist explained it was nothing much. They just needed to fill their stomachs before leaving since they had walked so far to get there. For that reason, before heading back, they would enjoy a meal first. But the dwarf wanted to know why they were doing this right there. At that moment, Rurin pulled out a sausage from the backpack, and since the dwarf didn't know what it was, the protagonist had to explain. A little later, he started frying the sausage. Both were savoring the aroma. The dwarf pleaded for them to stop because the smell wouldn't dissipate underground. But the protagonist kept saying how great it was. After all, they had walked a long way, so it was good to enjoy the delicious smell. That's when the trouble started. The people behind the gate began smelling the sausage. At this, the protagonist declared that they had actually brought the food as a gift for them, but since they weren't allowed inside, they would eat it all. Still, he really wanted to know what had happened. Or was he asking for too much? The dwarf behind the gate remained silent for a while. The protagonist realized they wouldn't get a conversation going, and to wrap things up, he pulled out a can of beer. He continued, saying it was a pity since he had salted those sausages to make them last as long as possible. And besides, they paired perfectly with beer. That was the last straw. The dwarf began opening the gate. Then he asked if they could at least taste a piece. A little while later, the protagonist had to fry or grill more sausages. The dwarves were completely shocked, or perhaps more like happy. Returning to the story, the protagonist felt a bit sad because it seemed the dwarves hadn't enjoyed a proper meal in a long time. It was clear their problem was their food supply, so he told them to enjoy and eat slowly, savoring every bite of the food. And they were thrilled, especially with the beer. In truth, the protagonist didn't want to give them beer, since it's not ideal for someone who's hungry. But since dwarves have a high tolerance for alcohol, it might be fine. Still, the protagonist had other matters to address and asked the leader if the food was good. The leader declared it was and that he owed the protagonist a great favor. The protagonist thanked him but requested information. He wanted to know if there was a dwarf named Gultazar there. This surprised the leader, who asked how he knew that name. The protagonist explained that he had met him in the past and wanted to discuss something with him. But since the two knew each other, everything was fine. As he walked through the dwarf village, the protagonist noticed there were about 30 dwarves there. He asked what the hell had happened for them to end up in that state. Sometime later, they arrived at a house slightly larger than the others, and the chief there informed Gultazar that someone wanted to speak with him. Permission was granted for him to enter. Gultazar, a bearded dwarf, greeted the protagonist, saying it had been a long time. He was the leader of the dwarves. Gultazar asked the protagonist if the person beside him was a noble, and Rurin remarked that he had sharp eyes. Gultazar said he was familiar with her aura. However, the dwarven guard chief was utterly confused. Why was their leader treating those two so formally? At that moment, Gultazar asked the protagonist what he wanted to tell him, and the protagonist replied that it was obvious. He wanted to know what on earth had happened there. In other words, how that once thriving mine had ended up in ruins. Looking troubled, Gultazar explained that it was due to an attack by a red dragon. They had desperately tried to defend themselves, but it wasn't enough. In the end, only a few survived to protect the place. The protagonist asked if the red dragon had red hair and horns growing backward. However, Gultazar revealed it wasn't just one. They had been attacked by a group of red dragons. That explained the numerous marks on the gate. However, it didn't make sense. From what the protagonist remembered, red dragons were incredibly selfish. So why would they cooperate with each other unless they had gone mad? Or it could mean they had a purpose more important than their egos. Something about it felt off. After a while, Gultazar pondered. He declared that it would probably be fine if it were the protagonist. First, though, he needed to follow him, as there was something he wanted to show. Gultazar explained that this wasn't the first time they had been attacked by the group of red dragons. To gain attributes or simply pass the time, there had been numerous attacks in the past. However, they had always had the strength to defend the place because there was a being protecting them, the noble and ancient dragon Color. He was the protector of the dwarves. The protagonist was astonished because that dragon's lair was enormous. Judging by the size of the corpse, that dragon must have lived at least 5,000 years. Gultazar continued, saying that Color didn't accept sacrifices or anything of the sort. He simply wanted to help the dwarves. He protected them from external threats and shared his wisdom with them. Above all, he was an exceptionally kind being. However, not even a dragon can defy time. But that wasn't what Gultazar wanted to show. He wanted to explain why the red dragons had been attacking them for so long, and yet why they persisted in staying in that ruined mine. It was all because of that, the ancient core, a mana essence capable of giving life to a dragon lord. Because of this, the dwarven tribe needed to protect it at all costs. A dragon lord can essentially make all other dragons obey them. For example, if that group of red dragons was acting together, it meant someone was commanding them. When they worked as one, no kingdom, or even the strongest warriors could stand against them. For those who didn't understand, in simple terms, it meant that, in the hands of just one being, the entire world could be destroyed. That ancient core that could give life to a dragon lord. Colored was one of the dragons capable of creating such an ancient core. He made it, and protected this place to keep it out of the wrong hands. It takes several of these essences to give life to a dragon lord. However, seeing it, Rurin was deeply shaken. She recalled a memory of her mother, her entire history, the moment she lost her, and when she was sent away to be imprisoned. She remembered her mother telling her repeatedly that she couldn't go there. But Rurin, as a child, had said her grandfather was an idiot and didn't know she was there. It was because of that foolishness that she ended up losing her mother. Out of nowhere, Rurin began crying profusely, calling out for her mother. At that moment, the protagonist declared the number 3. It required 3 of those essences to become a dragon lord. Seeing Rurin's reaction, Gultazar apologized. This made her remember painful things, as that core was filled with sad and painful memories. Colored had been searching for a way to destroy that core with their help, but they hadn't succeeded. And just at that moment, the protagonist declared that they were planning to build a lair in the city of Grake. He asked the dwarves to come with him and build a new village there because, as they must have noticed from Rurin's reaction, they didn't want to create a new dragon lord using that core. And since that place had already become a target, they would keep facing dragon attacks all the time. However, Gultazar was still hesitant, feeling that leaving that place would be unfair to Color. Of course, the protagonist wouldn't force him to do so, because he knew that for dwarves, their home was the most important thing. Therefore, the decision was up to him. Sometime later, the protagonist asked Rurin if she was feeling better. She replied that she was and asked if it was really okay for them to leave. After all, they should at least have taken the core. But the protagonist explained that he had already prepared some protective spells, so it shouldn't be a big deal. Besides, it was clear it wouldn't be easy for them to leave that place, since they had lived there for so long and had so many memories connected to it. Meanwhile, Gultazar was deep in thought when the captain of the guard appeared with one of the sausages the protagonist had fried. This surprised Gultazar because he hadn't eaten anything, and the guard explained that the sausage had been made by the protagonist and that everyone else was already eating. Outside his house, everyone was eating and drinking beer, which caught Gultazar off guard since it had been so long since he had seen them smiling. At that moment, he had a flashback of a conversation with Colored. Colored had asked him if it wasn't difficult and boring to live in such a dark and closed-off place. Gultazar explained that the place might be small for him, but for the dwarves, it was very spacious. However, Colored argued that the place was dull and had nothing there. but Gultazar declared that their mission was more important, so the location didn't matter much. At that point, Colored declared that, so far, he had been able to protect the core with his energy. But the day would come when he would no longer be with them, and they would become targets for all dragons. So, when he died, Gultazar should take all the dwarves and leave that place. There was no point in staying there just to protect his bones. After all, they were just bones, right? So there was nothing to worry about. But seriously, if no one were alive to remember him, or that place, everything would become meaningless. Therefore, they should survive because the dead should not bind the living. He only wanted to bring happiness to others' lives. He hadn't come this far to guide them to ruin. Gultazar was a bit confused. Colored had helped them so much, so they should repay him. But then they started joking around, and I'll skip that part. Witnessing the scene in front of him, Gultazar began trembling with happiness, as it had been so long since he had seen them laughing, and he apologized to Colored, because, finally, his foolish friend understood the meaning of his words. As the protagonist was leaving, all the dwarves suddenly appeared behind him, saying they would follow him and wanted to build a dragon's lair with him, and that's how the dwarf tribe set out for the city of Drake. The problem of building Rurin's lair was solved, and the protagonist left all the work in their hands. However, he asked Gultazar if it was really okay for them to start working as soon as they arrived. Gultazar said it was fine. After all, they had just been sitting inside that cave doing nothing, so they had plenty of energy to spare. Of course, everyone was eager to eat sausages, which wouldn't be a problem for the protagonist. At that point, he turned to Rurin and asked if she liked how things were shaping up. She replied that she did but would wait to see how it turned out in the end. However, there was still something missing, and going back a bit, Gultazar entrusted the ring containing the Dragon Lord's core to the protagonist, because he was sure the protagonist could use it for a good cause. The protagonist then asked Rurin if she wanted to absorb the core, to which she replied no. So, the protagonist decided to store it. Rurin declared that the birth of a Dragon Lord must not happen. The protagonist agreed but said they had other matters to address. Switching back to Serena, she was furious because, on top of taking a hit from the protagonist, she had been kicked hard by Rurin. She was already declaring that she wouldn't leave the spot. Hearing noises approaching, Serena asked if it was Garrett, and if it were him, she had nothing more to discuss. However, it turned out to be two shadows. The protagonist declared that he had found her hiding spot. He commented that, as she had mentioned before, she had never received an offering from the humans. So how on earth was her lair filled with gold and shiny objects? For that reason, he had come to ask her a simple question. Serena panicked, wondering aloud why this always happened to her. The protagonist then asked who Garrett was. From the way she spoke, it seemed like he was another dragon. Could he have helped attack the dwarves? Serena answered in a very low voice that he was her ex. But the protagonist didn't hear it, so she yelled that he was her ex. And because he was always chasing after her, she mistook the protagonist for him. The protagonist apologized. Serena then explained that she had only nested there for about 6 months. She hadn't encountered any dragon groups. Rurin then asked about all the gold there. Embarrassed, Serena snapped her fingers, and the gold began to disappear. This surprised both the protagonist and Rurin. Serena declared that it was all an illusion and asked if they were happy now. Or did they have to take everything she had to feel satisfied? Sometime later, back at the restaurant, the protagonist commented that he had made a mistake because, in his entire life, he had never seen a dragon cry so much. Rurin replied that, in the end, they hadn't learned anything about the dragons that attacked the dwarven mine. Serena also had no information about them. However, since they had a core, they could uncover details over time, especially about what the dragons were planning. At that moment, Ment and Helena arrived at the restaurant. Naturally, the protagonist was happy to see them. He asked Ment if he could use the boots yet. Ment replied that his foot wasn't fully healed but was much better compared to before. All thanks to Helena. She replied that it wasn't much, as Ment's willpower had also helped significantly. The protagonist declared that it all worked because Ment trusted Helena. Speaking of her, the protagonist asked if there had been any issues at the hospital recently. She replied no, because not long ago, Nellin and his mother had visited to express their gratitude. The miners also came to do the same, but for some reason, the number of patients was decreasing drastically. The protagonist started reflecting, suspecting that Rain had done something behind the scenes. At that moment, during their conversation, a dwarf suddenly emerged from the floor of the restaurant. He asked the protagonist if there were any more of those boiled chestnuts he had given them before. But to make matters worse, not even the protagonist knew there was a passage beneath his restaurant. While Helena was arguing with the dwarf, out of nowhere, the old butcher appeared asking for Woobabelly. Then, chaos erupted everywhere. Ment was talking to the butcher. The elf was arguing with the dwarf. With that, the protagonist commented that now it finally felt like a restaurant. Ruren asked the protagonist where the peaceful life he had wanted so badly was. After all the food was prepared, everyone got their desired dishes. Men took the pizza, the butcher ate meat, and Helena had pasta. The dwarves were eating sausage. The atmosphere was extremely cozy, but there was someone left out. It was none other than Dairan. He was watching the happiness through the window, and seemed like he wanted to say something to the protagonist. The moment his name was mentioned, the protagonist suddenly appeared beside him, asking why he was outside instead of coming in. Awkwardly, Dairan asked the protagonist if he could make desserts, and a bit confused, the protagonist replied that he could make a few. Out of nowhere, Dairan asked the protagonist to make one so he could give it to his mother, as it was the only way he could enjoy a beautiful meal with her smiling. Of course, at first, the protagonist didn't understand anything, and so we're transported to another kitchen. In this kitchen, the head chef was quite irritated, telling everyone to be careful not to burn the soup, and this was the kitchen of the Baron's castle. Dairan was showing it to the protagonist, commenting that all kinds of ingredients and tools were available there. If the protagonist needed anything, he just had to ask. The protagonist noticed that this kitchen was quite different compared to his. It had spices and condiments not found in common restaurants. Moreover, it seemed that the head chef was very skilled. Dairan commented that the atmosphere was a bit more tense than usual. The protagonist responded that it was obvious because Dairan was there. That's why people in high positions shouldn't walk around everywhere. Anyway, the protagonist had everything ready to make the dessert. And speaking of that, Dairan's mother had a napkin in her lap, but she didn't eat, which made the protagonist really sad. Dairan even tried to console him, saying that at least he thought his mother might try a piece. But the protagonist replied that it wasn't better to say that, because if she had tasted it and left it aside, it would have been much worse. Anyway, it seemed like she was keeping her distance from Dairan. The protagonist wanted to know why that was and, also, how long it had been since she stopped liking desserts. Dairan began telling him that, at the beginning, she wasn't like that. In fact, she always loved desserts, and she even opened up to them because of them. In a memory, Dairan recalled her telling him not to run inside the castle. Like I mentioned earlier, his mother was a very strict person. He hadn't seen her suffer for a few years, ever since they moved to the city of Drake, and Dairan's father always felt guilty about it. He didn't know what to do, so one day, during lunch, Dairan's father asked his wife if she wasn't being too strict with such a small child, to which she replied that she was only trying to teach him noble etiquette. It was clear that Dairan wasn't feeling well. At that moment, Dairan's father remarked that if it was about etiquette, then she was forcing herself not to smile because of it. He had noticed for some time that it seemed like she was carrying a huge weight on her shoulders. After all, during all those years, she never told him what kinds of things she liked or wanted to do. Was it that hard for her to feel a little comfortable around them? After all, that place was their home. But at that moment, Dairan's father looked at his wife and noticed that she had eaten all the dessert. That was the first thing he learned that she liked. And of course, since they had just arrived in Drake's territory, they had been neglecting desserts until then because they needed money. But since she loved them so much, they could find a way to get sugar. The problem was that they were in the middle of a war, but he would do his best. And that's how Dairan and his father discovered that his mother liked sweets. The problem was that after that, his father began bombarding her with all kinds of desserts, day after day. Of course, eventually, they couldn't stand eating so many sweets anymore. On that very day, Dairan's mother started laughing, declaring that they could stop now because she couldn't take it anymore either. Dairan remembered that day to this day because it was the first time he saw her smile. And one day, Dairan was casually walking in his house when he heard someone yelling at his mother, questioning how it made no sense that there was still no air. After all, 5 years had already passed. But as he got closer, the door was slammed in his face. After the man left, Dairan's mother appeared, and he asked her what had happened. She replied, as mothers typically do, that it was nothing, that the man was just angry, because there had been no news of their father, and from what Dairan had seen, that man was the lord of the city of Dedran. He was Count Dedran. At that moment, Dairan's mother replied that he didn't need to worry. After all, she belonged to the city of Drake anyway, and it was time for them to eat something. She had been acting this way because, after enjoying that dessert with them, she had become a much different mother. Of course, she was still the same strict person, but she started smiling more often and was constantly happy. Their family began to show the true essence of what it meant to be a family. However, that happiness didn't last long. At another moment, Dairan and his mother were trying to make a dessert, and the head chef wanted to help, but Dairan's mother insisted on doing it alone. At that moment, Dairan finished his dessert. They started playfully teasing each other. However, chaos erupted in the castle. Angry, Dairan's mother asked what was going on. The Baron's assistant declared that he had finally found them, and was there to report something urgent. The news was that the lord had collapsed. The cause was unknown, and there were no traces of poison. The symptoms were rare, making it difficult to determine the cause. He had reached a state where he couldn't respond or eat anything. In that moment of despair, Dairan turned to his mother. He remembered it vividly because her face was completely different from usual. Her expression lacked any sign of will, anger, or sadness. From that point on, his mother never touched another dessert. She even created a barrier between them. From then on, Dairan only expressed his emotions through the butlers around him and couldn't hear any conversations or laughter. It was at this point that all his actions began to be controlled. After living such a quiet life, he eventually ran to the protagonist's restaurant. He was so moved when eating the meals the protagonist prepared because they reminded him of the times he ate with his family. This was something he wanted to regain, no matter what. After all, eating a simple meal with the people you love is such an intangible dream. Sometime later, outside the restaurant, the protagonist reflected that something was very strange, because there were some things Dairan's mother did that didn't make sense. After all, just because Count Grake fell ill wouldn't be enough for her to distance herself from Dairan. Could it be because Dairan wasn't her biological child? However, that didn't make sense either. After all, she had already opened up to him before. Moreover, from what he had heard, Countess Verna fell in love with Baron Grake, even knowing he already had a son. So, what on earth was going through her mind? After thinking for a while, the protagonist came to a conclusion. She was feeling guilty. Some time later, the protagonist went to Rurin. She quickly hid a can behind her back, saying she hadn't done anything wrong. But it was hard to hide, as there was another can on the bed making a mess. Either way, the protagonist didn't want to reprimand her. He needed her help with something. The protagonist then asked if she would be sad if he collapsed and became unable to do anything. She replied that she would. With that, the protagonist confirmed his point, and they decided they should leave. The problem was that, if you looked closely, he hadn't explained anything. He continued his questions, asking if she liked sweets and wanted more. Now, let's switch to the Countess. At that exact moment, she was feeding the Baron. Her expression remained cold and impassive. However, at that moment, someone called for her. A butler appeared, saying it was almost time. Count Dedran was there. The Countess simply set the plate of food aside and left. But just then, the protagonist appeared. Now in front of the Count, the protagonist asked Rurin if she could fix him. Looking at him, she replied that she couldn't. She didn't even know what had happened because too much time had passed. She then asked the protagonist what on earth they were doing there. The protagonist replied that he was looking for some clues. After all, he didn't know what the Countess's true intentions were. At that moment, the Count turned to one side, surprising the protagonist because he had heard that the Count's eyes couldn't focus on anything. And now he was staring at something. Apparently, the place he was looking at was that piano over there. After investigating a bit, they ended up finding a kind of secret document, and after reading it, they understood why. The document proved that Countess Verna had embezzled taxes from the city of Grake and also contained detailed information about how much and in what ways it was diverted. The problem, however, was who had written it. At this, the protagonist asked Rurin if she wanted to pay a visit to the imperial capital. Or rather, Rurin needed to go there and bring someone back. Meanwhile, shifting to the Countess's side, she had finally met with Count Dedran, who was none other than her father, Baltor. Switching perspectives to Dairan, someone suddenly knocked on his door, making him wonder who would be there so late at night. The protagonist answered, saying he was the hamburger delivery guy. Seeing him there, Dairan was startled and asked what the hell he was doing there. The protagonist simply handed him the document and asked him to read it. And I don't know if Dairan was a bit slow, but he began reading it aloud. At this, the protagonist told him to lower his voice. After all, Count Dedran was nearby, and Dairan was still shocked because he discovered the reason his mother had been avoiding him. He asked the protagonist how he had obtained that information, and the protagonist replied that it was at the end of the letter. And upon seeing who had written it, Dairan was extremely shocked, so much so that he dropped the document. The protagonist continued, saying that the document hadn't been written by just anyone. It was the Countess herself who had confessed to her crimes. Faced with this, Dairan asked the most sensible question. Why would she confess to her own crimes? The protagonist declared that they could find out. Because, as Dairan already knew, Count Dedran was there. Back with the Countess, she asked her father what he was doing there. The Count responded with another question, asking if he needed a reason to visit his own daughter. But judging by Countess Verna's response, it seemed they weren't very close. At that, Count Dedran got straight to the point. He declared that he had heard some very interesting things recently. That the Crown Prince and Duke Porgo had recently visited the city of Grake, and it was Dairan who had received them and, in the end, treated them very well. The problem was that this information was quite different from what he had received. At this, the Countess replied that she had no involvement in that. Count Dedran continued, saying he had heard that Dairan was a young man incapable of doing anything on his own, but judging by his recent actions, it seemed he had gained some sort of self-confidence. In any case, he had become quite bold. This meant that he should do the same to Dairan as he had done to Ridden. Faced with this, the Countess asked what he was talking about. Count Dedran remarked that perhaps he shouldn't have said this, but since it slipped out, he would say it. He was the one who had poisoned Count Grake to make him ill, and he planned to do the same to Dairan. At this, the Countess exploded, declaring that he should not dare lay a finger on Dairan. But the Count never asked for her opinion, and this entire scene, this whole conversation, was being transmitted to the protagonist and Dairan. The protagonist was furious enough upon discovering that Count Grake had been poisoned by his father-in-law. This explained why the Countess had written the confession letter. She was planning to incriminate her father somehow. Meanwhile, Dairan was extremely angry. He was already declaring that he should rally all the castle's soldiers, but the protagonist stopped him immediately, declaring that he needed to consider the current situation, because Count Dedran's men were already infiltrated in the castle, to the point of being able to poison the food and kidnap the Countess. So could he truly trust the castle's soldiers? Oh, and even though the protagonist spoke this way, it was obvious he would help. However, it was highly unlikely that Count Dedran was carrying poison with him at that moment. So even if they arrested him, it would be very difficult to prove the Countess's kidnapping and Count Grake's poisoning. Or perhaps he planned to use the document as evidence, and if that were the case, they could definitely convict Count Dedran. However, Dairan's mother would also be punished. So what they needed to do was quite simple: create new evidence, and a situation to prove it. A situation where a high-ranking person could provide solid testimony, and that high-ranking person was right there, someone they knew very well. At that moment, the protagonist declared he had a plan but needed Dairan to act a bit. Switching to the Countess's side, she was in some sort of basement, and her father was already mocking her. He declared that the daylight was already breaking outside, but she couldn't see it. Either way, they had a place to go. She needed to follow him. However, at that moment, the Countess asked why he was doing all of this. After all, he had stolen all the taxes from the city of Grake and undermined all of Dairan's actions. She had done everything her father wanted, so why did he still insist on hurting her? But Count Dedran merely replied that his daughter had made very bold moves, and for that, he couldn't forgive her. In fact, he had first tried to poison Dairan. He wanted to claim the city of Grake using a more conventional method, after she bore an heir. The problem was that he wasn't sure if Raiden was too infertile, or if his daughter lacked charm. Either way, it seemed his dear daughter knew he was the one who had poisoned her husband. That was why she needed to act better. She should have shown more surprise when he revealed that he had poisoned her husband. At that moment, the Countess began begging for mercy. She pleaded with him to leave Dairan alone. At that point, Count Dedran declared it was too late. After all, breakfast had already been poisoned. So she didn't need to worry because, in the end, he would end up just like her father. In the face of this situation, the Countess began to cry. She called her father a monster and declared she was disgusted to share the same blood as him. In despair, she began calling out Dairan's name. At that moment, a soldier approached the Count, declaring he had found a document in Raiden's bed, and that document belonged to Countess Verna. In it, she had compiled evidence that she had stolen funds and taxes from the city of Grake under his orders. Hearing all this, the Countess fell even deeper into despair, while her father was delighted to have found it, because his dear daughter had lost her final trump card. Burning the document, Count Dedran declared that everything was over. The story would be this: after her husband lost his sanity, she lived with her son in mind. But in the end, he met the same fate, and in despair, she killed her husband and son, and finally, herself. That would be the perfect story. At that moment, the soldier asked the Countess if she was alright. Meanwhile, Count Dedran was attacking Dairan, and that soldier was none other than the protagonist, declaring that if a story was to be made, it should be done perfectly. And as the dagger neared Dairan, some kind of signal appeared, causing the dagger to catch fire. At that moment, who entered the room was none other than Medrin. She accused Count Dedran of attempting to assassinate the Count of Grake. This caught the Count off guard, but to further surprise him, Dairan rose from the bed. He declared that everything was over. Faced with the entire situation, the most shocked person was Countess Verna, who began to cry. However, unlike her, Dairan looked absolutely furious. The Count wanted to know how Dairan was even speaking. At that moment, Medrin stepped in, declaring to the Count that any resistance was futile. He should comply and follow the orders of the Imperial Palace. The Count had the audacity to ask what she was talking about. After all, he only had the dagger for self-defense, and it had fallen to the ground. Besides, he couldn't possibly have intended to harm Baron Dairan. And what did she mean by this attempted assassination against the father and son of Grake? Wasn't it only Count Raiden who was suffering from illness? However, this was exactly what Medrin had been waiting for. At that moment, she brought out the food that was meant for Baron Dairan. And if it truly wasn't poisoned, the Count should eat it to prove his innocence. The Count approached the food, but it was obvious he wouldn't eat it. He then asked everyone why he was the only one being accused of crimes. After all, Countess Verna had been stealing taxes from the city of Grake for many years. If they were going to discuss crimes, they should arrest her first. At that moment, Dairan asked him what he was talking about. What was the evidence for that? The old man lost his temper, to the point of ordering the soldiers to attack. The poor soldiers tried, but Medrin stopped them. She declared that there are certain things in the world that must never be tampered with, no matter the cost. Be it the captain of the Order of Knights, a renowned duke, or even the emperor, the rule applied to all. So how could he, a mere noble from the countryside, dare to cross that line? At that moment, the knight captain issued an order. All his soldiers were to eliminate the pests within the city of Grake, and anyone who neglected this task wouldn't leave in one piece. Faced with the situation, Count Dedran had no choice but to reveal his true face, questioning how they dared to do such a thing. But in the end, it didn't help him much. All the soldiers were arrested, as were Count Dedran's infiltrators. It seemed the situation was wrapping up, as everything had already escalated quite a bit. The protagonist announced he was leaving. After all, the Baron was safe, and even Countess Verna questioned who the protagonist was. But at that moment, Dairan caught her attention. He asked if she was okay and if she wasn't hurt, to which she replied that he didn't need to worry about her. She was just happy he was safe. However, Dairan asked why she wouldn't look him in the eye, and she admitted it was because she was a criminal. Everything that had happened was her fault. To make matters worse, she had embezzled taxes from the city of Grake. She knew her father was the criminal, but she ignored everything and continued her life, only to end up putting him in mortal danger. For that, she apologized. Hearing this, Dairan realized his mother had always lived with guilt. So why would she need forgiveness? After all, Count Dedran was the only one at fault, not her. But he asked why she had handed over those documents without telling him, questioning if she thought he would be grateful if she were taken and imprisoned. No matter what had happened, she should have told him, not just him, but his father as well. After all, they were a family, and no matter what happened, they would always stand by her. Then came the tears and forgiveness. In short, the family reconciled. Now, moving away from that heartfelt scene, we switched to another scene. Count Dedran was questioning who they thought they were to condemn him, saying they were making a mistake. Did they think he had no contacts in the Imperial Palace? But just at that moment, someone arrived, questioning Count Dedran about who he thought he was, or better, what gave him the right to speak so arrogantly and presumptuously. Seeing the protagonist, the Count asked if, by any chance, he was someone sent by the Empire. But the protagonist didn't answer that. Instead, he commented that the Count had built a vast castle and territory. Even so, he still wanted to get his hands on the city of Grake. If that was the case, the protagonist would show him something, to show how fragile his castle truly was. The castle he had spent his whole life building. And apparently, the sight was terrifying enough because the old man, who was already very ugly. Now, speaking of more beautiful things, we return to the city of Grake, where the Countess was asking Dairan what all of that was. Dairan replied that he wanted to eat outdoors with her and his father. That's why he had prepared all that, a dessert party. The people there were everyone who had helped him, or rather, they were all the restaurant's customers. At least the main ones were there. Speaking of dessert, it was obvious the Countess was getting hungry, but at that moment, Medrin caught everyone's attention. She asked them to look toward the city of Dedran because, to celebrate tonight's party, there would be a special show. When they looked, there was a giant castle in the sky, glowing brightly. Suddenly, it was smashed to pieces, which I'd say was quite satisfying. That thing in the sky was the man's castle, destroyed by our protagonist. The protagonist stated that he wouldn't see those lights anymore from now on. For that reason, he should savor it well. And with that, the protagonist blew up Count Dedran's castle. He created a spectacle of fireworks, and seeing this, Dairan turned to his mother and asked what she thought. Taking a piece of bread, she declared that this was, without a doubt, the best dinner of all time. And speaking of time, a little later, after the dessert party, Countess Verna was saying that today had been very enjoyable. In fact, it had been a long time since she had eaten a dessert without so many worries, but now she felt relieved, because the castle where her mother had confined her was destroyed, and she didn't need to worry about Dairan. She knew she had been acting foolishly. From now on, she wouldn't run away out of guilt, but leaving that aside, there was something she hadn't been able to say for a long time, something she should have said earlier. However, she was grateful to at least be able to say it now. With all her courage, she wanted him to listen closely. Her words were that Verna Grake, his wife, loved Ridden Grake, her husband, with all her heart, now and forever. Now, putting aside this beautiful scene, Let's move on to a scene that might be satisfying to some and not so much to others. For Count Dedran, he certainly wasn't enjoying it. At this moment, Dairan commented to the protagonist that, even though they had eliminated several spies, they shouldn't relax too much, so the protagonist should remain cautious. The protagonist replied that Dairan had done a good job. Now, you might be wondering why Dairan was there. Simple. The protagonist had also kidnapped him in the middle of the night. Following this, the protagonist asked Dairan if Duke Porgo had been upset, and Dairan replied that the Duke had been confused at first. But he hadn't refused when he heard the protagonist was responsible, and, had he known the situation beforehand, he probably would have wanted to come himself. Internally, Dairan reflected that it was indeed a surprise. Even so, he knew the protagonist was definitely strong, but compared to before, he seemed much stronger now. The protagonist continued commenting that it was quite impressive, like a cannonball shot, and from now on, all the city of Grake needed was to look forward to a brighter morning. But it seemed the protagonist's words jinxed the entire city because that bright morning failed to materialize, right on Laundry Day. Meanwhile, in the barn, Ment and Miltine were struggling to fix the fence, to the point where Miltine got hurt in the process. And well, because of the weather, either of them could tend to the ranch today. In other words, all outdoor activities were prohibited. In the end, they couldn't fix the fence, nor was the laundry done. The protagonist told them not to feel so bad. He needed a lot of help serving customers because, even with the bad weather, many clients came to the restaurant. So they needed to dry off first, otherwise they might catch a cold. Of course, Miltine wanted the old butcher to dry her off, but obviously he didn't. While the protagonist was drying Rurin, another customer arrived, commenting that it was quite a pleasant sight. The protagonist recognized the customer, calling him Venin, who immediately asked about the menu for the day. A little later, the protagonist brought out the food and served some quality beer. The dish, for those curious, was pasta made with palenque broth, a chicken noodle dish, essentially. This surprised Venin because, from what he had heard, the protagonist had stopped selling palenque. The protagonist explained that more of that meat was now available at Mr. Knoll's shop, who he often referred to as the old butcher. Apparently, Venin was the owner of a farm, and the protagonist asked if the farm was doing well, given the weather. This led to a lengthy conversation, which I'll summarize. Apparently, before opening his restaurant, the protagonist had tried to buy Venin's farm, but in the end, he couldn't, and now it was even less likely, as the price had increased tenfold. Venin replied that there wasn't much he could do now since the rain wouldn't stop just because he stood in front of the farm. But of course, he hadn't left his farm unprotected in the heavy rain. He had built a small barrier to shield it. Returning to the topic of food, Venin commented that it was delicious. At that moment, Rurin, visibly irritated, approached the protagonist, asking if he was going to ignore her. The protagonist explained that he had customers to attend to, sparking a playful quarrel between them. Meanwhile, as Venin filled his cup with sake, he asked the protagonist a question, asking if he had ever made a decision in his life that he regretted. This caught the protagonist by surprise because it came out of nowhere. The man started drinking and asking nonsensical questions, continuing to talk about a decision he should never have made, and that, if he could, he would go back in time. The kind of decision that, every time you close your eyes, resurfaces and hurts your heart. Venin mentioned that it seemed like the protagonist wasn't getting along with his wife, but the protagonist clarified that they weren't a couple. Returning to Venin, he began saying that, even though he was alone, there was someone he used to love. He then started telling his story, going back 30 years to when he was 10 years old. He had only ever loved one person. In other words, it was his childhood friend, and from that point on, he couldn't love any other woman but her. Her name was Meal, and no matter how much time passed, he could never forget her name. This was somewhat surprising because he had feelings for the same girl for 30 years and never did anything about it. The protagonist asked if he had ever confessed to her, and Venin replied that he had. That was his regret because, at the time, he was a clueless child. He enjoyed being with her. He thought they would naturally end up together if things stayed the same, or so he believed. But as they grew older, and she started talking about marriage, that's when he began to realize things. However, it was too late by then. She already had a marriage proposal from someone else and was about to move to a neighboring city. That's when he finally gathered the courage to confess to her, and even asked her to meet him in the city of Grake to discuss something. But, as we can already guess, they never met, and the reason is already known. He explained that this happened 15 years ago, when the war against the dragons began, and because he was cowardly and powerless at the time, he ran away. Now, you might be wondering, did the girl die? Actually, no. He later found out she was fine, but he never managed to go after her. After all, he couldn't even keep his promise to meet her because he was a coward. That's when he revealed why he was talking about this now. It wasn't because of the protagonist and Rurin or because of the alcohol. It was because Miss Meal, whom he hadn't seen in 15 years, had returned to the city of Grake some time ago. In short, he only feels regret and pain because of that day. He can't forget or undo it. And even though he misses her every day, he can't walk the streets out of fear of running into her. For that reason, the protagonist should treat his wife well, so that even if she leaves tomorrow, he wouldn't have any regrets. Once again, the protagonist told him that Rurin wasn't his wife, but Venin explained that it seemed that way. The protagonist continued reflecting on Venin's words about missing someone for 15 years. And speaking of that, for Rurin, it had already been 150 years. Embarrassed, he wondered why he was dragging her into this. After all, she had said she had only been in the city of Grake for a short time, so he decided to ask about it from someone. That someone was none other than Rin, who mentioned that she knew Miss Meal. Apparently, she had recently opened a repair shop. Because of that, they had grown quite close, which was expected of Rin, who talked to everyone and everything. Rin mentioned to the protagonist that Miss Meal had recently been worried about something. When the protagonist asked about it, Rin continued, saying that she had seen Miss Meal looking very sad recently. This brings us to Rin's perspective. Miss Meal had asked her a question, if she had ever made a decision she regretted for the rest of her life. It was the same thing Venin had said. Rin asked the protagonist if he was talking about Venin, the owner of the orchard. The protagonist asked Rin if she could elaborate on what she had said earlier. Returning to Rin's story, Meal had asked if she had always lived there, and Rin replied that she hadn't, explaining that after wandering due to the war, she decided to settle in the city of Grake because of her husband. And Meal commented that it was just as she thought because she didn't remember Rain. After all, she had left the city of Grake 15 years ago, and had only recently returned. Back then, she had someone she loved, or rather, she still loved him, but she couldn't look him in the eyes. 15 years ago, he had asked her to meet him, but she couldn't make it in time. She ended up fleeing that place. However, from the stories she had heard, the person who had called her had supposedly been waiting at the meeting spot while she ran away like a coward. Hearing this story, the protagonist commented to Rain that the person Meal was talking about was none other than Venin. Meal's regret was the same as Venin's. Both of them had gone to the place where they were supposed to meet but fled from the dragon's attack. They each thought they had left the other behind, and even now, 15 years later, they both regretted that day. Meal was deeply moved by this love story because, as she had told herself, she had lived alone ever since. She had rejected every marriage proposal her father had tried to make her accept, all because of guilt. She believed she had been at fault, and the protagonist told Rain that she didn't need to worry too much. He just needed her to say something to Meal. Meanwhile, with Venin, the protagonist handed him something. Of course, Venin asked what it was, and the protagonist replied that it was a pair of glasses to give as a gift, since Meal had said that her eyesight had been worsening recently. If he wasn't afraid, he could take them to her again. But Venin didn't understand what the protagonist was saying. The protagonist simply told him that tonight, Meal would be waiting for him outside the city walls of Grake. He could give her the glasses then. Just as Venin was about to say something, the protagonist remarked that, as Venin himself had said, this was a decision he regretted. And in reality, mistakes like this could be made by anyone. After all, there isn't a single person who hasn't made a mistake. However, worrying about the same problem your entire life, that's a different story. Either way, Venin knew what he needed to do. That night, he walked to the place the protagonist had mentioned. Venin felt his steps were heavy, and a whirlwind of thoughts flooded his mind. He wondered if she would be angry with him or call him a coward for running away, or if she would even show up at all. Deep down, he missed her terribly, but he didn't know how she would react. Even from a distance, he began telling himself it would surely be pointless. Since he had spoken a bit too loudly and they were the only two there, Meal heard his voice. She called his name, asking if it was really him. Venin trembled so much that he almost ran away again. However, that wasn't what he should do. As Venin stood silently, Meal began to say that she had something to tell him about that day. Hearing this, Venin calmed down a bit and declared that he also had something to tell her. Internally, he was already half expecting her to scold him harshly. At the very least, he thought, he would finally free himself from this lifelong regret. And so, in unison, they both apologized for not being able to meet each other that day, 15 years ago. After this declaration, either of them fully understood what was happening. However, after thinking for a moment, they both realized how wrong they had been. Watching from afar, Rain was overjoyed that the misunderstanding had been resolved. She also asked why the protagonist hadn't just told them the truth from the beginning. The protagonist replied that this was a problem they needed to resolve on their own, and it wasn't their place to interfere. Rain commented that it was a little sad that they had spent so much time apart because of such a simple misunderstanding. The protagonist remarked that it was actually fortunate it was a simple misunderstanding because, if it hadn't been, they wouldn't have resolved it so quickly. After all, as he had heard from Venin, this was something that had tormented him for 15 years, and he had finally lifted that burden from his shoulders. Oh, and after that, the two returned to the city of Grake without letting go of each other's hands. A few days later, they appeared at the protagonist's restaurant to sell the orchard that Venin had built with so much love and care. Of course, the protagonist had to pay up front because, apparently, it was to build a house in the middle of the city. They were getting married, as Venin had already waited 15 years. Switching scenes, the protagonist commented that there was a lot of land around the restaurant, which was a problem because he couldn't build the dwarves' village. But with this new piece of land he now had, he could make it work for them. Rurin commented that this was good since she didn't like the idea of dwarves sleeping in the area meant for the construction of the lair. That place was supposedly hers and the protagonist's. Speaking of which, she knew the protagonist would stay at the restaurant. However, the lair was very spacious, and the protagonist quickly caught on, remembering Venin's words about not having regrets. With that, the protagonist asked if, by any chance, when the construction of the lair was complete, he could live there with her. Obviously, Rurin was very happy, and the protagonist remarked that the place was spacious, which was why he'd moved there. Rurin declared that it was a promise, and as he knew, a dragon's promise lasts a lifetime. Time passed, and it was now autumn. At that point, the lair's construction was 70% complete. According to the eldest dwarf, meeting the deadline next year wouldn't be too difficult. The protagonist thanked them. However, the elder dwarf remarked that they still hadn't paid their debt since the protagonist had given them land to build their village. Switching topics, Miltine commented to the protagonist that the number of cows had increased as well. Because of this, he would need to build another barn. Meanwhile, more people had shown up at the restaurant. The protagonist noted that since they needed to expand the barn due to the increase in cows, they would likely have to hire more staff. At this point, the old butcher wanted to help with the interviews, but the protagonist instantly rejected the idea. In the distance, two beggar siblings approached the restaurant. Their names were Linty and Matt. A while later, they arrived at the restaurant, and Linty introduced himself. He mentioned that he had seen the job posting and asked if they could apply. Upon seeing the flyer, the protagonist commented that they had already collected those job postings some time ago. So, where had they gotten it? Hearing this, the two became a bit embarrassed. Regardless, the protagonist was about to issue new job announcements. He wanted to see if they were capable. But first, he needed to feed them. He prepared slices of pork with butter in a frying pan. In another pan, he sautéed onions, mixing them with garlic and mushrooms. When they began to change color, he added tomato sauce, some spices, and deglazed the pan with beer, cooking everything together. At the end, he added MSG, a flavor enhancer. After letting it cook for a while, he ended up with a pork stew. Seeing the meat in front of them, Linty became very emotional, and the protagonist commented that since he had made plenty, they didn't need to worry about the quantity. Once the two took their first bite, they reflected on how tender and flavorful the meat was, savoring every bite. Coupled with the hunger caused by their struggles, it tasted incredible. Linty commented that it was the best meat he had ever eaten in his life. The guy was smart, buttering up the boss even before getting the job. In any case, the protagonist got straight to the point. He wanted to know if the two had a special reason for wanting to work on the ranch. Linty commented that they loved animals, although he didn't know much about other things. However, he and his sister were very persistent and wouldn't give up easily. Hearing this, the protagonist asked Helena if that was true. She confirmed it was, regarding the persistence and all. However, they were hiding an important detail, and immediately, Linty grabbed his wrist. Noticing this, the protagonist asked if they could show him. After removing the bandages from their arms, it became clear that both had several marks on their wrists. For those who didn't catch on, those were marks from shackles, indicating that they were criminals. And Matt wanted to explain the situation to them, but Lindy stopped her. He then apologized to the protagonist for hiding the truth. He also asked the protagonist to believe him when he said he had no bad intentions. However, he understood that it was too much to expect the protagonist to hire them, so they would leave. Outside, Matt asked why they didn't tell the whole truth, especially since the people there seemed to be good-hearted. Linty replied that, regardless of the situation, a crime is still a crime, and he didn't want to make excuses for what had happened before. However, he didn't regret his actions. Matt asked if he didn't even regret finishing the food. To that, he had no answer. Later that night, after the restaurant had closed, Rurin asked the protagonist if the two had really failed the interview. The protagonist commented that the two seemed to have a story to tell, but if they didn't explain themselves, there wasn't much he could do. Depending on their character, Miltine and Met might end up in a complicated situation. In any case, they needed to print more flyers. At that moment, the protagonist noticed they had run out of spices and decided to go buy some. He performed the summoning ritual, but this time he became very dizzy, which Rurin found strange, because usually, the protagonist didn't feel so unwell. He explained that if it weren't for the Lord's heart he had consumed, he would never have been able to use that magic. However, this time, the protagonist was in much worse condition, unable to use any magic. Even the spell drying the dishes stopped working, and the protagonist collapsed to the ground. Then, he heard an internal voice saying that if he had known this would happen, he would have accompanied him that day. Some time later, the protagonist began to open his eyes, and Rurin was crying in front of him, asking if he was okay. He replied that he was. He had just run out of mana. However, the issue was that the protagonist was a 9th class mage, so how could he run out of mana so quickly? Once again, he told her to calm down. He assured her that he would recover after resting. Suddenly, Rurin declared that she would take care of him today, so the protagonist could ask her for anything he wanted. And with that, he already had something in mind. In the kitchen, Rurin was a bit annoyed because, of all things, the protagonist had asked her to cook something for him. He wanted to eat food made by her. Switching back to the homeless siblings, Matt was saying that even if they tried to find a job, they wouldn't be accepted because they were ex-criminals. That's why they went to the protagonist's restaurant, located deep in the slums. Linty commented that, at least in prison, it was warmer than outside. Faced with this situation, he said he couldn't bear it any longer. They had already been through so much. He didn't care about other people anymore. Sometime later, they were eating food from the trash. That food, in fact, was meant for the cats. Matt remarked that now they truly were criminals. However, the cat they had stolen from was crying, and Linty suggested digging deeper into the trash. At that moment, Matt called Linty's attention, and they saw someone, questioning whether Matt and Linty had really been released from prison today. If so, they needed to be found immediately. According to what Matt said, that man was the construction supervisor, and his name was Ratanda. Just seeing his face made Linty furious, because Ratanda still didn't understand what he had done wrong. Matt managed to hold him back, warning that if he acted out again, this time, they wouldn't get away with just 2 years in prison. To explain the story, we need to go back 2 years. As mentioned before, Ratanda was the construction supervisor. The problem was that he constantly harassed women. On one of those days, Linty had come running, desperate, declaring that a support pillar in compartment 3 had collapsed. Several workers had been injured. Hearing this, the woman who was being harassed started running. But Ratanda wasn't pleased with this, declaring that they were fools for not being able to set up a simple support beam properly. Linty began explaining that they had installed everything correctly, but it seemed the materials were defective, which was the last straw for Ratanda. He questioned whether Linty was insinuating that he had stolen materials from the construction. At that point, Ratanda started yelling at Linty, calling him a worthless unemployed orphan and threatening to fire him on the spot. He even declared that the damages Linty had caused would be deducted from his wages. At that moment, Matt stepped in between them, begging for forgiveness. Seeing her, Ratanda smirked and commented that perhaps he had a better job for her, something that could help her pay him back. After all, many nobles had peculiar tastes. Hearing this, Linty didn't hold back and punched Ratanda. The other two tried to restrain them but couldn't, and Linty kept landing punch after punch. This was the reason Linty ended up in jail, and to make matters worse, inside the prison, he kept getting into fights with other inmates. He did it to protect Matt from them. Remembering all this, Linty commented that he wasn't thinking straight back then. For now, they needed to find a way to avoid being found by Ratanda. Meanwhile, Ratanda was furious that he couldn't locate them, declaring that he would make them pay much more. Those 2 years in jail were nothing compared to what they owed him. He insisted that they had to be found no matter what, even if it meant beating them senseless to drag them back to him. One of his subordinates suggested that since Duke Dedran had been taken to the capital, it might be best to avoid causing too much trouble. Hearing this, Ratanda slapped the subordinate, declaring that he didn't need anyone to protect him. At that moment, in the distance, he spotted someone. It was none other than Helena. Seeing her, Ratanda naturally headed toward her. After all, he only wanted to ask her a little question. Returning to the protagonist, he discovered the reason he couldn't accumulate any mana. It was a side effect of absorbing the ancient core. In reality, he had never wanted to absorb it in the first place. Apparently, the massive accumulation of mana from this world had finally been triggered, and the protagonist needed to stop the connection. Because once he started absorbing the core, there would only be one outcome, even if he stopped halfway. For now, he just needed to wait for his late-night snack, which he had asked Rurin to prepare earlier. He figured she had watched him cook for years, so surely she must have learned something. But his stomach began growling, and he wondered if this would be his end. Switching to Rurin, she had prepared several dishes, none of which looked remotely appetizing. Looking at the food, she realized the protagonist couldn't eat any of it. She thought of calling Helena since her tribe's mana transfer might help the protagonist recover. Despite not liking the idea of being near the protagonist, she would have to endure it for his sake. But not knowing where Helena's clinic was, she would have to follow the scent. However, Rurin kicked a chair in frustration, declaring that she didn't have any scent to follow. Since it had come to this, she considered just getting food from another restaurant. But as she thought about it, she questioned why she was seeking someone else's help. She then remembered the moments she had shared with the protagonist. In one of those moments, she had admitted that she didn't know how to use healing magic or cook. However, the protagonist had told her that, despite differences in race, abilities, and personality, that shouldn't isolate her from others. After all, even though she was a dragon, she couldn't survive in this world alone. Frustrated, she wondered why she couldn't do anything for the protagonist. Meanwhile, back with Helena, one of the men was trying to grab her. He remarked that elves were very beautiful but said that, even though he had visited her clinic a few times, it seemed like she didn't remember him. Touching her, he claimed he was looking for someone and threatened that something bad would happen to Linty and Matt if she didn't cooperate. He asked if she knew where they were. One of his men commented that it was unlikely an elf living on the city's outskirts would know two people who had just been released from prison. However, Helena replied that she did know where they were. This left the men surprised, and they wondered how she could know. Despite this, she firmly stated that she wouldn't tell them, creating a magical circle above her head, blinding them momentarily. The man called her a whore, stating that all they ever did was run away. He asked how an inferior elf dared to flee from him, and said she would regret it once he caught her. As he was about to reach her, Linty punched him and apologized to Matt, saying he couldn't stand it anymore. His men were worried about him. Linty declared that he couldn't hold himself back against that man, but Matt replied that it was better this way, because this time, at least they'd be able to spend the winter in a warm place. At this moment, Helena asked how they had ended up in such a situation. Matt told Helena to leave, as they had unfinished business with those guys. Meanwhile, Linty was furious because this time Ratanda was involving innocent people. It seemed he needed to be reminded of what had happened 2 years ago. But at that moment, Ratanda pulled out some kind of whistle, which caught everyone off guard. Ratanda remarked that the events from 2 years ago would surely be settled today because they would be the only ones to die tonight. At that moment, 3 different individuals appeared, with the man in the middle being the leader of the Great City gang, Roman Horde. Meanwhile, back at the old butcher's shop, someone was knocking on the door late at night, and Rain was questioning who it could be. When she opened the door, it was none other than Rurin, who stated that she had smelled something familiar nearby and asked where Helena's clinic was located. Back to where Helena was, Linty was being beaten. Matt had tried to help her brother, but if Linty couldn't do anything, it was obvious that she couldn't either. Once again, Linty was powerless while his sister was in danger. Ratanda was feeling completely superior, declaring that Roman Horde's skills were far above those of an ordinary person. After all, he was a veteran mercenary who had spent years fighting on the battlefield. Roman asked if he should keep hitting them. Ratanda instructed him not to touch the sister because she was useful in many ways. However, Linty's fighting spirit hadn't yet faded. But that was precisely what the gang enjoyed because it allowed them to keep beating him even more. Meanwhile, Matt wanted to help her brother, and even Helena wished she could heal him, but both were helpless, unable to do anything. As he was being beaten, Linty began to wonder what he had done wrong to deserve such a fate. Should he have ignored the entire situation? Should he have closed his eyes and ears, pretending nothing had happened? Deep down, he knew that if he had ignored it, he would never have been able to move forward. Yet, in the end, he didn't have enough strength. At that moment, someone arrived, shouting that they had finally found her. It was none other than Rurin. At least she had met Helena along the way. She said she needed help, but given Helena's condition, she couldn't do much. After all, the situation was a bit complicated. Rurin approached the gang leader, and he was terrified because every instinct he had was screaming that the person in front of him was extremely dangerous. There was no way he could survive except to bow down to her immediately. At that moment, Rurin asked if she needed to get rid of them first. Instantly, Roman Horde, the gang leader, ordered his subordinates to release everyone. Ratanda didn't understand anything, questioning why they were just standing there watching. In the end, only he was left. Even his subordinates had fled. Enraged, he tried to grab Rurin. Seeing this, she remarked how interesting it was, noting that she didn't know Garbage had learned to talk lately. What followed was Ratanda's screams of pain, and she asked Helena to come with her, as she had taken care of everything. Later, back at the restaurant, the protagonist felt much better after the mana transfer. Helena, however, was still drained, and of course, the protagonist thanked her. She had helped them once again, and he commented that the amount of mana she had provided was enough for him to handle his daily life. She replied that it was good to hear. However, internally, she reflected that she had given him all her mana, but even that hadn't been enough. Anyway, Rurin didn't seem too happy, probably because she was jealous of Helena. So much so that Rurin called her out. questioning if her name was really Helena, to which Helena, of course, confirmed that it was. She had already said so before. Somewhat embarrassed, Rurin thanked Helena for helping the protagonist. Hearing this from Rurin, even the protagonist couldn't believe what she was saying. Seeing their reactions, Rurin got annoyed and declared that she would never say such a thing again since it was the first time she had done so. But steering away from this argument, the protagonist asked when the two of them were going to come in. Embarrassed, Linty and Matt entered the room, and Linty declared that he was there just to thank the protagonist for saving him. But it didn't make sense since it was Helena who had helped them, not the protagonist. Matt explained that Ratanda had been after them from the start, and that unrelated people had been caught up in the trouble because of them. The protagonist told them not to blame themselves since the construction supervisor was infamous for things like this. Taking advantage of the moment, the protagonist asked why they hadn't told him this from the beginning. With conviction, Linty declared that, looking back at what he had done, if he had to do it all over again, he would make the same choices. So he didn't want to lie and say he regretted his actions. The protagonist simply asked if they had a place to stay that night. If not, they should take the coin he offered and find a nearby inn. Linty asked why he was giving them this, and the protagonist replied that it was obvious. They were going to start working at the ranch the next morning. As for their crimes, they had already paid for them in theory, so the protagonist had no problem with it. Hearing this, the two knelt and called the protagonist brother, or rather, they should have called him boss, but the protagonist preferred to be called the restaurant's manager. The next day, Linty and Matt introduced themselves to Mint and Miltine. They declared that they were the new ranch workers, and Miltine was very excited because she would be their senior. However, looking at the marks on their arms, Mint still felt uneasy. He admitted he wouldn't say much since the protagonist had chosen them personally, but he made it clear that he didn't trust them yet. However, there was one thing he agreed with them on. He probably would have punched Ratanda too. Anyway, they were in the middle of work hours, so it was time to get to it. Back with the protagonist, he had recovered most of his magic, and if things continued at this pace, there would be no adverse effects when using his mana. At that moment, he began to wonder if the item he had ordered had arrived yet but decided to set it aside. He noticed Rurin observing the customers and asked why she was doing that. Rurin replied that she realized there were many things she didn't know about. Hearing this, the protagonist was somewhat shocked. After all, Rurin was never interested in other beings. This made him think she had been acting strange lately. She had even thanked Helena and was now observing all the female customers. More specifically, their earrings and necklaces, and she wanted to know why women wore those. The protagonist commented that they were pretty, and besides, dragon lairs are full of treasure, so he assumed she understood such things. Rurin replied that her mother's lair didn't have that kind of thing. The protagonist asked if she had ever wanted to give or receive something like that. Looking at Venom with meal, Rurin answered that she didn't understand, so she didn't know. But speaking of shiny things, someone appeared. It was none other than Diran, bursting in with some good news. Apparently, that morning, Ratanda had been arrested at the hospital. For tax evasion, harassment, sexual assault, theft, he had committed many crimes, and to make things worse, there were numerous witnesses against him. In short, he probably wouldn't see the sun rise round ever again, and the protagonist commented that Ratanda was worse than he had imagined. Diran continued, saying that one of Ratanda's trusted employees had provided all this information. The person backing Ratanda was none other than Dedran. Despite Count Dedran being imprisoned, Ratanda hadn't considered his own inferior position and continued his actions. The problem was that Count Dedran had many henchmen. Every time they dealt with one, many more would appear, making it a tough task to handle those guys. The protagonist remarked that he was working hard. Changing the subject, he asked Diran if he had free time during the night 3 days from now. Diran replied that he would make time for sure, and when he asked why, the protagonist leaned in and whispered something into his ear. Diran immediately declared that he would participate. 3 days later, the old dwarf was silent. The protagonist then arrived and sat at the table. The old dwarf remarked that the protagonist had come at just the right time. When he was about to say something, the protagonist interrupted, stating that first, he needed the items to be delivered. The old dwarf confirmed that he had managed to get them, and upon looking inside the bag, the protagonist declared that they were perfect. He handed over the trade item to the dwarf, a pile of beer and sausages. Returning to normal, the old dwarf questioned why the protagonist wanted to go about things this way. The protagonist simply replied that it was something he had always wanted to do. Besides, he wanted everyone to take part in what he was preparing. However, the leader of the dwarves commented that the construction would soon be finished, so the protagonist should understand. That evening, various people were heading to the restaurant, including the old butcher along with Rain. Even the ranch workers were coming. Inside the restaurant, Rurin asked what all of this was about. Caught off guard, she questioned if she really didn't know what day it was. At that moment, the protagonist called everyone's attention, thanking them for being there. He explained that he had prepared a small event for all those who had loved their restaurant during all this time. It would start with a game called What's in My Mouth? And the rules were simple. All the participants had to do was wear a blindfold and guess the food they were served. Those who guessed correctly would receive a big prize. The first participant was none other than Miltine, who nervously asked the protagonist if, by any chance, he would give her something that wasn't food. The protagonist replied, "Of course not, though it might be slightly different depending on the situation." With that, the protagonist offered the first spoonful. Miltine began chewing and noticed it was warm and soft. However, after a while, it felt like something was wriggling in her mouth, and she quickly spat it out. The protagonist declared her disqualified. What Miltine had eaten was just a regular marshmallow, but she didn't know what that was. The protagonist explained that they were sweets made of sugar, essentially a food that didn't exist in this world. How could she guess it correctly when even with her eyes open, she wouldn't know, let alone blindfolded? Moving on to the next participant, it was the old butcher's turn. He was given a chili pepper, and Rain was quite annoyed with him because he was disqualified over such a weak pepper. The protagonist declared that things were getting quite interesting. The next participant was none other than Rurin, which took her by surprise. She hadn't expected to participate in the quiz either. The protagonist declared that, of course, she would, but she wasn't allowed to use magic. The protagonist offered her a spoonful, and Rurin began to reflect on what the protagonist thought of her. Obviously, she would guess correctly since she planned to use her dragon senses. The first thing she noticed was that what she was eating had a soft texture, similar to bread. It also had the taste of whipped cream. She recognized it because they had eaten it at a dessert banquet recently. There were several layers inside, and of course, it was very sweet. It even had fruity flavors, so after thinking for a bit, she already knew what it was. It was none other than cake. The moment she removed her blindfold, everyone began cheering and setting off fireworks. The protagonist declared that she had guessed correctly. However, to be more precise, it was a birthday cake, and the birthday was none other than Rurin's. Realizing this, Rurin had completely forgotten it was her birthday, which made sense since she had lived for so long. So much so that the protagonist had noticed she had forgotten, even though she had mentioned it to him before. Realizing the entire situation, Rurin felt slightly embarrassed as everyone had gathered there for her. So, the only thing she could say was, "Thank you." Right. But no, she didn't say it. Her dragon pride was too strong. Anyway, since it was a birthday, it was time to give gifts, right? And the protagonist had a present for her. The dwarves had worked hard to make it. It was an earring, or so it seemed, and seeing it, Rurin was a bit impressed, questioning when the dwarves had time to make it, and more importantly, when had the protagonist found time to arrange for it as well? The protagonist replied that there was no way he could forget to prepare something for her birthday. He then helped her put on the earring, and after looking in the mirror to see how it looked, judging by her expression, it seemed she liked it. But of course, she wouldn't admit it. She muttered softly that it was at least decent, but internally she thought otherwise. She finally understood why women always felt happy when they received jewelry from others, especially when it came from someone dear to them. Anyway, it was time to continue the festivities, and the next person was Rain. When she began chewing, she noticed it was quite crispy. However, the old man in the back declared it was disgusting because she was eating an insect. But no, it was just fried shrimp. Moving on, the next one was Linty, and the protagonist might have been a little mean to him. The food wasn't very good. Anyway, it was grilled wooba meat, which, if you don't remember, is pork. The party continued with everyone happy and eating. That's obvious, right? Because when you're eating, no one is sad. A while later, after everyone had left, Rain commented that it was the first time so many people had gathered for her birthday. Hearing this, the protagonist asked Rurin if she was okay since this birthday was her last one before reaching adulthood. For some reason, she seemed a bit embarrassed but said she was fine. However, looking out the window, the protagonist noticed something was happening outside. He called Rurin to come with him, and when they got there, it was snowing. Of course, to match the snow, and being the natural cook he was, the protagonist decided to make hot chocolate. With this, he commented that winter had arrived so quickly that he hadn't even noticed. Rurin asked how that could be, as it had only been a year since the protagonist had arrived there. But as you know, the perception of time for a dragon compared to a human is entirely different. For the protagonist, it had been much longer than a year. However, Rurin questioned if that was really the case, as it should be different for the protagonist. After all, he had eaten the heart of a dragon lord. The protagonist replied that no one knew if a dragon's heart had the effect of extending life. After all, he was the first human to consume one. Besides, he hadn't consumed all the lord's hearts. To break the heavy mood, a shooting star appeared in the sky. The protagonist told Rurin to make a wish because, being her birthday, it might come true twice over. Another shooting star. Looking at it, Rurin made a silent wish to stay with the protagonist for a long time. Curious, the protagonist asked what her wish was, suggesting he might make the same wish as her. But of course, she wouldn't tell him. Now switching scenes, in another location, specifically, a giant floating castle, the Black Dragon's palace. There was a very irritated man, demanding to know where his uncle was. Oh, and this man was Nies, who was also a black dragon. The reason for his anger was that he wanted to know how long they would leave the protagonist alone. Was the promise they had made with him really that important? His uncle was, of course, also a black dragon, named Dihegma. Returning to their conversation, Dihegma questioned Nies if his complaints had anything to do with Rurin. Since Nies remained silent, it was practically a yes. Dihegma then called Nies an idiot, saying that if he cared so much about Rurin, he should have treated her better when she was still there. And really, it hadn't been that long ago. So why on earth would she return to the place where she was mistreated? Trying to dodge the topic, Nies told Dihegma that this wasn't just about his personal interests. It also involved the survival of the entire Black Dragon race. Because the females of their race, especially the young ones capable of bearing children, had died during the last Great War. And since they didn't know how long this brief period of peace would last, they couldn't just sit back and wait because of a promise. Hearing this, Dihegma asked Nies what he was supposed to do. Drag Rurin over there? And that was basically what Nies wanted. Dihegma told Nies that the protagonist was someone they couldn't touch. Or rather, it would be best if the protagonist didn't kill him, but there was no point in warning him. After all, he had never met the protagonist personally, and Nies didn't believe the protagonist was that powerful. Furthermore, if they broke the promise, it would tarnish the honor of the dragon race, and Lord Mediana would never allow him to perform such an unjustifiable act. Hearing this, of course, opened a loophole, right? It meant he could proceed if he had a justification. Seeing that Nies had something in mind, Dihegma remarked that it was fine, as he wasn't particularly fond of the promise they had made to the protagonist either. However, if things went wrong, he would wash his hands of the matter and pretend it never happened. So, Nies would be on his own, and Nies declared it would be fine. After all, they were saviors, not usurpers. Switching scenes again, now on Mount Miliorek. Rurin was upset, questioning the protagonist about what on earth they were there to find. The protagonist replied, mushrooms, which seemed ridiculous because they were essentially at the North Pole to find mushrooms. However, the protagonist explained it wasn't that simple. These mushrooms were extremely rare, and he had learned about them from a conversation between two restaurant customers. The story was about a nomad guiding some pigs when one of the pigs suddenly began frantically digging a hole in the ground. In the end, the pig found a mushroom that only appears once in a lifetime. After finding the mushroom, the nomad gifted it to the empire, earning a significant amount of gold coins, so much that you'd likely never have to worry about money again. Naturally, after hearing this story, the protagonist became very interested. In fact, he already knew what this rare mushroom was. It was a truffle or something very similar to truffles from our world. But then came the question, how were they supposed to find it in all that snow? The protagonist began explaining that the smell of this mushroom was much stronger than usual. The problem was that it was difficult to find since it grew underground. However, this wouldn't be an issue since he had Rurin with him, who had the senses of a dragon. Faced with this, Rurin asked what the smell was like. Hearing this, the protagonist froze. How was he going to search for truffles if he didn't know what they smelled like? And since they could only be found by scent, he started wondering if he would have to summon modern truffle oil. But there was no guarantee that the truffles here smelled the same. At that moment, several orcs appeared, hunting a giant white cat. The cat was doing its best to defend itself. However, the enemy had the numbers advantage, and the white cat soon found itself in trouble. Before the attack could land, a magic circle appeared between them, created by none other than the protagonist, declaring that while the orcs probably had their reasons for fighting, they could no longer continue. The orcs turned their attention to the protagonist, but when Rurin displayed a fraction of her power, the orcs trembled in fear and fled. Seeing this, the protagonist felt a bit disappointed, as the orcs hadn't fled because of him. Rurin remarked that to achieve that, he would need to be as dignified as a dragon. However, at that moment, the one who attacked the protagonist was now the white cat. But it wasn't an attack. It knelt before the protagonist. It began speaking in a series of unintelligible nar-nar sounds. Rurin translated for them, explaining that the cat was essentially thanking them for saving it. Now, it wanted to repay their kindness. Later, inside a cave, they found several smaller cats, likely the reason the white cat had been defending the area so fiercely. It turned out that it wasn't a cat but a female one. At this, the protagonist asked Rurin what they were going to get in return. Rurin mentioned that he might be able to find a treasure for them since, from the moment she entered that cave, she had sensed a strange smell. A while later, the giant female cat appeared with a very odd thing on her arm, and Rurin immediately started complaining about the smell. She declared that it definitely wasn't a treasure, but in the protagonist's eyes, it absolutely was. However, the author didn't want us to know what the treasure was yet, and instead shifted the scene to another location with 3 black dragons, Darba, Nekwu, and Hoven. They were questioning what Niz was doing there with that furious expression on his face. He declared that he was going to bring Rurin back to the sacred land, leaving everyone a bit confused. Nekwu then remarked that perhaps Niz was looking for a mate now, and considering Rurin's appearance, she wasn't a bad choice. However, there was one problem. She was with the protagonist. Hearing this made Niz furious. Declaring that he didn't like it, he demanded to know why they were honoring such a foolish promise with a mere human. Not to mention Rurin's overconfidence, which only made him want to take action. Additionally, he had already received Lord Dihegma's permission. Dihegma had said it was fine as long as they could find a justification. Nekwu asked how they were supposed to find one. Darba commented that it would probably be very difficult since direct attacks on humans were forbidden due to the treaty. The only exception was if humans killed someone from their race. Nekwu stated that didn't make sense. Even if the protagonist was a powerful mage, he couldn't harm dragons. So essentially, the treaty was there to protect humans. However, Niz argued otherwise. He declared that, for the protagonist, it would definitely be possible. This statement shocked everyone present. At that moment, a 5th voice chimed in, stating that if that were the case, he could help them. The black dragons were immediately annoyed, questioning how he could help. The red-haired one, who was actually a red dragon, said he knew another red dragon. This man was Jard. For those who don't remember, he's the guy behind bars and Serena's ex-boyfriend. Now, switching back to the protagonist, the treasure was finally revealed, and it was exactly what we expected. It was the truffles he had been searching for. The cat started babbling something incomprehensible, and Rurin translated. Apparently, the truffles were a daily food source for them, and since the area was full of them, she had settled in the cave to raise her cubs. However, to Rurin, the truffles were rotten and useless, so she suggested throwing them away. But the protagonist disagreed. He said those truffles were incredibly valuable. Hearing that they were a basic food for the white cat, he realized they were exceptionally good at finding truffles. With that in mind, the protagonist asked Rurin to translate his words to the cat. First, he thanked her for the gift. Since he liked it so much, he offered to appoint her as the guardian of their dragon lair. This, he explained, would be much better than her staying in such a dangerous place since the village around the lair was much more peaceful. Rurin was confused, and the protagonist explained that every lair needs a guardian. Apparently, the cat agreed. However, Rurin was furious because the lair was supposed to belong only to her and the protagonist. Speaking of lairs, the scene shifted to another one, Serena's, and she was in bad shape. She was recalling the embarrassing scene in front of the protagonist and Rurin, where she had admitted that all that gold was just an illusion. The protagonist had tried to comfort her, but unlike him, Rurin bluntly criticized her, saying her lair was in terrible condition. Hearing this, Serena asked what Rurin's lair was like. Rurin admitted she didn't have one yet. In fact, she was still building it. This rendered Rurin's criticism meaningless. After all, how could she criticize Serena's lair when she didn't even have one? However, Rurin declared that she had a restaurant with the protagonist, and even though the restaurant wasn't as spacious as a lair, she had never felt frustrated with it. Recalling all this, Serena wondered if, by any chance, she should look for the protagonist just to kill time. However, while she was lost in thought, she sensed a very familiar aura and even wondered if it was the protagonist. She immediately began asking if, by any chance, they had come to bother her there. Yet, just by hearing the voice, Serena was already quite annoyed. After all, it was none other than Jard himself. Naturally, she asked what he was doing there, and whether he had taken her threat as a joke. At that moment, Jard said that wasn't the case. He simply wanted to start over with her, as he had realized after so much time that she was the only one who had loved him sincerely. And now that he had finally understood, he wanted to spend the rest of his life by her side. However, that was the worst possible response or declaration for Serena. She asked when he had come up with that thought. After all, she had begged him not to leave, but he simply disappeared without a word. In any case, he was still just a scoundrel, and to begin with, he hadn't even come there of his own accord. Faced with this, Jard declared that there was no point in hiding anything anymore. And right at that moment, from the ceiling of the lair, 3 black dragons appeared, ready to attack. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.